Have you ever been invisible in your own family? I was. For 35 years, I sat at that dinner table watching my mother worship my sister while treating me like I didn't exist. Every achievement I earned was dismissed. Every sacrifice I made went unnoticed. But the night my mother told me my sister deserved more than you because she's actually made us proud, something inside me snapped. I reached into my purse and pulled out a single envelope. Inside were bank statements, receipts, and wire transfers spanning 6 years. The mortgage I saved when they nearly lost the house. The medical bills I paid so my father wouldn't drown in debt. The credit cards I cleared so my sister could pretend she was successful. $189,000. Every single cent I'd given in silence. When my mother opened that envelope, her face went white. But what she said next, that's when I realised the betrayal went so much deeper than I ever imagined. Stay with me, because by the end of this story, my entire family will wish they'd seen me sooner. My name is Whitney Jordan. I'm 35 years old, and for the last decade I've worked as a senior financial advisor at one of the most respected firms in the city. My clients trust me with their life savings, their retirement dreams, their children's college funds. They call me reliable, thorough, someone who sees the whole picture. But sitting at my parents' dining room table on a Tuesday evening in March, I might as well have been invisible. The celebration was for Lydia. It was always for Lydia. My sister had just been promoted to marketing director at her company, and my mother had insisted on a family dinner to mark the occasion. The table was set with the good china, the kind that only came out for special moments. There were flowers in a crystal vase, champagne chilling in an ice bucket. My mother had even made Lydia's favourite dessert, a triple-layer chocolate cake that took hours to prepare. I sat at the far end of the table, the seat closest to the kitchen, the seat where you put the guest who arrived uninvited. My plate was full, but I hadn't touched it. I just watched as my mother held court, her face glowing with pride as she recounted every detail of Lydia's career trajectory as if she'd memorized a script. And the vice president told her she was the most innovative mind they'd had in years, my mother said, her hand resting on Lydia's arm. Can you imagine, at only 32, already making this kind of impact? We always knew you were destined for greatness, sweetheart. Lydia smiled that perfect smile of hers, the one that had been winning her praise since childhood. My father nodded along, sipping his wine, offering the occasional, "That's wonderful, honey." He glanced at me once just briefly, but said nothing. 15 minutes. That's how long my mother talked about Lydia's promotion. I counted. Then, as if suddenly remembering I existed, my mother turned to me. Her expression shifted, not unkind exactly, but cooler, distant. "And you, Whitney," she said, her tone flattening. "At 35, you still haven't done anything worth being proud of." The words hung in the air like smoke. My father looked down at his plate. Lydia took a slow sip of champagne, her eyes flicking toward me, with something I couldn't quite name. Pity, maybe, or satisfaction. I didn't respond. I'd learned long ago that defending myself only made things worse. Instead, I reached for my purse, which sat on the floor beside my chair. My fingers found the envelope I'd tucked inside that morning. It was thick, the paper slightly worn from how many times I'd opened it, closed it, and wondered if I'd ever have the courage to use it. Inside that envelope was a record of every dollar I'd given this family over the last 6 years. The mortgage payment that saved them from foreclosure during the pandemic. The medical bills I'd paid when my father had his heart surgery. The credit card debt I'd cleared for Lydia when she was too embarrassed to ask anyone else. $189,000. Every wire transfer, every cleared check, every sacrifice made in silence. I'd kept the receipts because some part of me always knew this moment would come. The moment when staying quiet would hurt more than speaking up. I set the envelope on the table beside my untouched plate. My hand was steadier than I expected. My mother was still looking at me, waiting for me to shrink back into the corner where I belonged. Lydia had already turned her attention back to her phone. My father was refilling his wine glass. I took a breath. "Mum, I said quietly, my voice cutting through the comfortable hum of their celebration. "There's something I need you to see." My mother's eyes landed on the envelope, but she didn't reach for it. Not yet. Instead, she gave me that look, the one I'd seen my entire life. The look that said I was interrupting something important, that whatever I had to say could wait until after Lydia's moment was properly honoured. But I couldn't wait anymore. Not after what she'd just said. Not after 35 years of being the afterthought. Sitting there, my hand still resting on the envelope, I felt myself slipping backward. Not physically, but mentally, into the long corridor of memories I'd spent decades trying to lock away. Memories that explained exactly how I'd ended up here at this table, holding proof of my worth because I'd never been given it freely. I was 8 years old the first time I understood I was less than Lydia. It was the year she started piano lessons. I can still see her sitting at the upright piano in our living room, her small fingers stumbling through beginner scales while my mother stood beside her beaming with pride. I'd been so excited thinking that I'd get to learn too. I loved music. I'd spent hours listening to my mother's old records, imagining myself playing something beautiful. When I asked if I could take lessons, my mother barely looked up from where she was correcting Lydia's hand position. "We can't afford lessons for both of you," she said simply. "Lydia started first, so she gets to continue." There was no discussion, no consideration of taking turns or splitting the time. Just a door closed before I'd even stepped through it. I remember standing in that living room listening to Lydia's halting notes and learning my first lesson about my place in this family. I was expendable. Lydia was essential. 8 years later, when I was 16, I earned a full scholarship to a prestigious university 3 states away. I'd worked myself to exhaustion for it. Perfect grades, leadership positions, volunteer hours that stretched into the hundreds. When the acceptance letter arrived with the scholarship offer, I'd been so proud I could barely breathe. I'd run into the kitchen waving the paper, thinking that maybe this time this achievement would be big enough to matter. My mother read the letter, nodded and handed it back to me. "Well, it's good you got a scholarship," she said, turning back to the pot she was stirring on the stove. "Because we couldn't have sent you anyway. Not congratulations, not pride, just relief that I wouldn't cost them anything." I went to my room and cried for an hour, that letter crumpled in my fist, trying to understand why my achievements only mattered in terms of what burden they removed. By the time I was 25 and landed my first 6-figure salary, I'd learned not to expect much, but some desperate part of me still hoped. I'd called my mother from my new office, my voice trembling with excitement, as I told her about the offer, the salary, the partnership track I'd been placed on. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then my mother said, "Office work pays that much. Must be one of those companies that throws money around. Not skill, not hard work, just luck. Just another way of saying I hadn't really earned it." But the deepest wound, the one that had never healed, happened when I was 12. I'd come home early from school sick with a fever, and my mother hadn't heard me come in. She was on the phone in the kitchen with my aunt, her voice carrying through the house. "I only wanted one child," she was saying. "One was always the plan. Whitney was an accident. I've learned to live with it, but sometimes I wonder what life would have been like if it had just been Lydia." An accident. Something to be lived with, like a chronic condition or a regret you couldn't undo. I'd stood in the hallway, my hand pressed against the wall to keep myself upright, those words branding themselves into my memory. I never told anyone what I'd heard. I just carried it with me, a stone in my chest that grew heavier every year. Now, sitting at this table with the envelope in front of me and my mother's dismissal still ringing in my ears, that 12-year-old girl's pain rose up in my throat. All those years of trying to prove I was worth keeping, worth loving, worth noticing. My throat tightened with decades of accumulated hurt, but I didn't look away from my mother's face. This time, I wouldn't disappear. My mother was still staring at me, waiting for me to explain myself to justify interrupting Lydia's celebration with whatever trivial concern I'd brought to the table. She had no idea. None of them did. They'd spent so many years seeing what they wanted to see that they'd completely missed who I actually was. The irony wasn't lost on me. At work, I was someone entirely different. I was Whitney Jordan, Senior Financial Advisor at Clearwater Financial Group, one of the most respected wealth management firms in the region. My office was on the 14th floor with a view of the city skyline. My clients trusted me with millions of dollars in assets. Last year alone, I'd managed portfolios worth over $30 million, and my success rate in meeting or exceeding client goals was in the 97th percentile. Just 3 weeks ago, a couple I'd been working with for 5 years told me I was the most trustworthy advisor they'd ever had. The husband had actually teared up when I'd shown them their retirement projections, realizing they could retire 2 years earlier than planned because of the strategies I'd implemented. "You changed our lives," he'd said, shaking my hand. "You gave us our future back." But to my family, I was just someone who worked at a bank. A secretary, probably. Someone who shuffled papers and answered phones. My mother had introduced me that way to her friends more than once. "This is Whitney. She works at a bank downtown." Not a financial advisor. Not a professional with a decade of experience and multiple certifications. Just someone who worked at a bank the way you might describe someone who worked at a grocery store or a gas station. A job, not a career. I'd never corrected her. What would have been the point? The truth was, I'd made choices that reinforced their misconceptions. I lived in a modest, one-bedroom apartment in a quiet neighborhood, not because I couldn't afford better, but because I didn't need more space, and I hated waste. I drove a 2015 Honda Civic with 120,000 miles on it. The car ran perfectly, got excellent gas mileage, and didn't draw attention. I didn't vacation in Europe or post pictures of expensive restaurants on social media. In fact, I barely used social media at all. My Instagram had 6 photos, all of them from years ago. To someone like my mother, who measured success by appearance and performance, I must have looked like I was barely getting by. She'd probably told her friends I was struggling. Poor Whitney, still trying to figure things out at 35. Not like Lydia, who drove a leased BMW, wore designer clothes, and posted about her life, constantly curating an image of success that looked impressive, even if the reality behind it was far more complicated. My humility had become a weapon they used against me. My choice to live quietly had been interpreted as failure. But the people who mattered knew differently. My colleagues knew. 2 months ago, I'd been invited to speak at a leadership conference in Chicago about portfolio diversification strategies for high net worth clients. I'd presented to a room of 200 financial professionals, and afterward at least a dozen people had asked for my contact information, wanting to discuss potential collaboration. My managing director had pulled me aside and told me I was on the shortlist for junior partner, a position that would push my annual compensation past $200,000. Yet I wasn't invited to my cousin's wedding last fall because my mother told my aunt there wasn't room for everyone. And Lydia should really be there since she's doing so well in her career. I found out about the wedding from Facebook, seeing photos of Lydia in a bridesmaid dress standing next to our mother, who was beaming at the camera. I'd sent a gift anyway, a generous one. I always did. My phone buzzed on the table, the screen lighting up with a notification. I glanced down at it reflexively, and my stomach clenched as I saw the email subject line, "Monthly transfer confirmation. Family support account." It was the automatic reminder I received every month confirming that $2,700 had been transferred from my checking account to the joint account I'd set up 5 years ago. The account my parents had access to. The account I'd created when my father had his first health scare and my mother had mentioned casually that they were worried about making ends meet with all the medical bills. I told them it was temporary, just until they got back on their feet. But temporary had stretched into months, then years, and I'd never stopped the transfers. $2,700 every single month automatically deducted. 60 months. 5 years of consistent support that I'd never mentioned to anyone because I knew what would happen if I did. My mother would either deny needing it or find a way to make it seem insufficient. So I just kept paying, kept quiet, and let them believe whatever they wanted to believe about my life. I did the math in my head quickly the way I did for my clients. 2,700 times 60, $162,000, just from that account alone. That didn't include the mortgage payment I'd made during the pandemic, or my father's surgery bills, or the credit card debt I'd cleared for Lydia. The notification on my phone showed the transaction details. Family support, 60 months ongoing. 60 months of making sure they were okay. 60 months of sacrifice they didn't even know about because they had never asked what I did with my money, how I spent my time, or whether I might be struggling myself. They just assumed I had nothing to give because they decided long ago that I was nothing. I looked up from my phone and met my mother's eyes. She was getting impatient now, her jaw tight, her fingers drumming lightly on the table. Lydia had noticed the tension and put her phone down, watching us with interest. My father was the only one who looked concerned. He'd always been quieter, less openly critical, but his silence had been its own kind of abandonment. I picked up the envelope with steady hands. "You said I've never done anything worth being proud of," I said, my voice calm despite the tremor I felt inside. "I think it's time you knew exactly what I've been doing." I opened the envelope and pulled out the first document. It was a bank statement from April 2020, highlighted in yellow, where I'd marked the transaction, $47,000 wired to my parents' mortgage company. I slid it across the table toward my mother. "This was during the pandemic," I said. "March 2020. Dad's business had shut down temporarily. You called me one evening and said you'd gotten a foreclosure notice. You were terrified. You said you didn't know what you were going to do." My mother's face shifted, something flickering in her eyes that might have been recognition or denial. I couldn't tell which. "I transferred the full amount the next morning," I continued. $47,000 to cover 3 months of missed payments and late fees. The bank withdrew the foreclosure proceedings within a week. I remembered that phone call so clearly. My mother had been crying, something she rarely did. She'd said they might lose the house they'd lived in for 30 years. I'd been at my desk working from home, and I'd pulled up my banking app before she'd even finished explaining the situation. The transfer had taken less than 2 minutes to complete. "I remember you telling Mrs. Chen next door that you'd managed to work it out on your own," I said quietly. "That you'd figured out a way to keep the house." My mother's lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't deny it. I pulled out the next set of documents. Medical bills from Mercy Hospital, each one stamped paid in full. "Dad's heart surgery," I said, looking at my father now. His face had gone pale. "February 2021. The insurance covered most of it, but you still had $31,000 in out-of-pocket costs. The hospital was going to put you on a payment plan with 18% interest." My father's hand had moved to his chest, right over where the scar from his surgery would be under his shirt. "I called the billing department and paid it in 6 installments over 3 months, I said. "I told them I was calling on your behalf and to mark the account as settled. You never got another bill because there was nothing left to bill." "Whitney," my father started, his voice rough. But I wasn't finished. I laid out the next document. A promissory note handwritten on a piece of notebook paper. Lydia's handwriting I noticed now with a strange sense of detachment, looping and careless, like she'd written it quickly because she had known it didn't really matter. $27,000, I said, my eyes moving to my sister. "December 2022. You called me crying, said you'd made some bad financial decisions and your credit cards were maxed out. You said you were going to lose your apartment. You promised you'd pay me back within a year." Lydia's face had flushed red. She opened her mouth to speak, but I kept going. "I saw your post on Facebook 6 months ago," I said. "The one where you talked about how you'd overcome debt through discipline and smart budgeting. You got 400 likes. People were congratulating you in the comments, asking for advice." "I did work hard," Lydia said defensively. "I changed my spending habits." "With my money," I replied. "Money you never paid back." Money you're apparently not planning to pay back since you haven't mentioned it in over 2 years. The silence at the table was different now, heavier. My mother wasn't looking at me anymore. She was staring at the papers spread across the tablecloth, her face unreadable. I pulled out the last section of documents, and as I did, my phone buzzed again. Another email notification. I glanced at it and felt my blood go cold. It was from my credit monitoring service, something I'd subscribed to years ago. Monthly transfer activity report. But as I scanned the summary, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. 8 transfers over the past 3 years, ranging from $5,000 to $8,000 each, all marked as family emergency approved by account holder. I didn't remember approving these. I would have remembered. These weren't the monthly automatic transfers I'd set up. These were separate, additional. I opened my banking app with shaking fingers, navigating to the transaction history. Each transfer had a note attached. Family emergency. Approved by account holder. But when I looked at the IP address log, something I'd never thought to check before, my stomach dropped. Every single one of those transfers had been initiated from an IP address I didn't recognize. Not my home, not my office. I copied the address and ran a quick reverse lookup on my phone. The address was registered to this house, my parents' house. Someone had logged into my account from here. Someone had transferred money out of my account without my knowledge, marking them as approved, making them look legitimate. I looked up slowly, my hands trembling. Now the phone still clutched in my fingers. There are 8 other transfers here, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. $53,000 total. I didn't authorize them. My mother's face had gone completely white. But they were all initiated from this address. I continued, turning my phone screen toward her so she could see the IP lookup results. From this house, someone logged into my account and took money without asking me. The room felt like it was tilting. My father looked genuinely shocked, his hand gripping the edge of the table. Lydia had gone very still, but my mother just sat there, frozen, staring at the phone in my hand like it was a weapon pointed at her chest. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. My mother's mouth opened slightly, as if she were searching for words that wouldn't come. My father had gone completely still, his wine glass forgotten in his hand. Even Lydia, who always had something to say, seemed temporarily at a loss. But Lydia recovered first. She always did. "Well," she said, her voice carrying that forced lightness she used when she wanted to change an uncomfortable subject. "I think we're all getting a little too intense here. Maybe we should just enjoy the dinner Mum made." She picked up her champagne glass and took a deliberately slow sip, then set it down with a small smile. "Besides, I have some exciting news I haven't shared yet. Michael and I booked our trip to Europe. 3 weeks in Italy and France. We leave next month." She said it casually, like we were all friends catching up over brunch instead of sitting in the wreckage of a conversation that had just exposed something dark and unforgivable. 3 weeks! My mother echoed, latching onto the lifeline Lydia had thrown her. The colour was slowly returning to her face. "That sounds wonderful, sweetheart. You deserve it. When you work as hard as you do, you deserve to play hard." There it was. The phrase that had been used to justify everything Lydia got, everything Lydia wanted for as long as I could remember. You deserve it. As if deserving was something innate to her and absent in me. That's the thing about success. Lydia continued, warming to her theme now, her confidence rebuilding with every word. You have to know when to reward yourself. Life's too short not to enjoy the fruits of your labour, you know. She glanced at me briefly, and there was something pointed in her expression. Something that said, unlike some people who apparently just stay home and save every penny. My mother nodded along enthusiastically, as if Lydia had just shared profound wisdom. Exactly. You've always known how to live well. Not everyone has that ability. I mean, it's about balance. Lydia went on, and I realised she wasn't going to stop. She was going to keep talking, keep redirecting, keep pretending the documents spread across the table weren't there. Work hard, play hard, that's always been my philosophy. My mother turned to me then, and I saw it in her eyes before she even spoke. The dismissal, the comparison, the final insult that would be disguised as casual observation. Not like Whitney, who's always home early. My mother said, her tone almost pitying. Must be nice to have such an easy job. No stress, no late nights. I suppose that's its own kind of blessing. An easy job. 30 years of building a career, of earning the trust of clients who depended on me, of studying for certifications and attending conferences and managing portfolios worth millions of dollars. All of it reduced to an easy job because I didn't perform my exhaustion for them. Because I didn't complain about working late or brag about my stress level or make a show of how busy and important I was. I felt something inside me shift. Something that had been bending for 35 years finally snapped. "Mum," I said quietly, cutting through Lydia's ongoing description of the villa they'd rented in Tuscany. "Do you remember March 2020? My mother's face changed. It was subtle, just a slight tightening around her eyes. But I saw it. "March 2020. I repeated, my voice steady now. "Do you remember that month?" "I don't see what that has to do with—" she started. "It was the month you called me crying," I said. "You were terrified. You said you'd gotten a foreclosure notice on the house. You said you didn't know what you were going to do." The colour drained from her face again. Lydia had gone quiet. "You told me the bank was going to take the house unless you could pay 3 months of missed mortgage payments plus late fees," I continued. "You said Dad's business was shut down because of the pandemic and there was no money coming in." My father was looking down at his plate, now his shoulders hunched. "I transferred $47,000 the next morning," I said. "I emptied my entire emergency fund and took out a personal loan to cover the rest. You were crying when I called you back to tell you it was done. You said I'd saved your lives." My mother opened her mouth, but nothing came out. "And then, a week later, I heard you telling Mrs. Chen that you'd managed to work it out on your own," I said. "That you'd figured out a solution without anyone's help." "We were embarrassed," my mother said finally, her voice tight. "We didn't want the neighbours to know we'd needed help." "But you were fine with me knowing I didn't matter," I replied. "You were fine with looking me in the eye tonight and telling me I've never done anything worth being proud of." "That's not what I meant." "That's exactly what you meant," I said, and I was surprised by how calm I sounded. How clear. "You've meant it my entire life. Every time Lydia got something and I didn't. Every time her achievements were celebrated and mine were dismissed. Every time you introduced me as someone who works at a bank while you told everyone Lydia was destined for greatness." I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the floor. The envelope was still on the table, documents spilling across the white tablecloth, like evidence at a crime scene. "You said I haven't done anything," I said, looking down at my mother. "You said at 35 I still haven't done anything worth being proud of." I reached down and gathered the papers into a neat stack, then set them directly in front of her. "Here's everything I've done," I said. "Every dollar I've paid. Every debt I've cleared, every crisis I've solved while you told the world you did it on your own." My mother stared at the stack but didn't touch it. "Maybe you can tell me," I said, my voice finally carrying the weight of 35 years of invisibility, "how much your easy job daughter is worth now." My mother's hands were shaking as she reached for the stack of papers. I watched her fingers hover over them for a moment before she finally pulled the first document toward her. The pages rustled in the silence. Everyone at the table had gone completely still. She read the first bank statement slowly, her eyes tracking across the numbers. April 2020, $47,000. Mortgage rescue payment. Her lips pressed together into a thin line, but she didn't look up. She just moved to the next document, Mercy Hospital billing statement, February 2021, $31,000, paid in full by Whitney Jordan. The date of my father's surgery was printed at the top, along with the procedure details. Triple bypass, life-saving, expensive. I saw my father's hand move to his face, covering his mouth. His eyes were glistening. My mother kept reading. The promissory note from Lydia came next, that careless handwriting promising repayment that never came. I watched Lydia from the corner of my eye. She'd gone very pale, her champagne glass frozen halfway to her lips. She set it down carefully as if any sudden movement might shatter something. "That's not..." Lydia started, but her voice died when my mother glanced at her sharply. My mother read on. "The monthly automatic transfers, 5 years of them, documented in neat rows. $2,700 every single month to the joint account. Never missed, never late. A total of $162,000 just from that commitment alone." Then came the pages I'd printed just this morning after discovering them. The unauthorized transfers. 8 of them, each one highlighted. 5,000 here, 8,000 there. All marked as family emergencies. All approved by an account holder who had never actually approved them. All traced back to this house. My father pulled one of the pages toward him, his reading glasses sliding down his nose as he studied it. I watched his face as he read the transaction details, the dates, the amounts. A tear slid down his cheek and he didn't wipe it away. He just sat there, this man who'd had open-heart surgery 2 years ago, whose life I'd helped save with money he didn't even know I'd paid, and let himself cry quietly. "Dad," I said softly, but he shook his head. "Don't," he whispered. "Let me finish reading." My mother had made it to the final page now. I'd created it specifically for this moment, knowing I'd need one clear summary that showed everything. It was formatted like the financial statements I created for my clients. Clean, professional, impossible to misunderstand. At the top, in bold letters, financial support provided by Whitney Jordan to family, 2020-2025. Below, that each contribution was listed with dates and amounts. The mortgage rescue, the medical bills, Lydia's debt, the monthly transfers, the unauthorized withdrawals, every single dollar accounted for. And at the bottom, in 18-point font that took up its own line, total $189,000. $189,000. Nearly $200,000 given to a family that had spent my entire life telling me I wasn't worth their pride. My mother stared at that number. I watched her eyes track across it once, twice, 3 times, as if she couldn't quite process what she was seeing. Her face had gone from pale to grey. Lydia leaned over to look at the summary page, and I saw the exact moment she registered the line item with her name on it. $27,000 credit card debt. Lydia Jordan. Her mouth opened slightly. She looked at me, then back at the paper, then at our mother. "I didn't," Lydia started. "I was going to pay it back. I just needed time." "It's been 2 years," I said quietly. "You've had time to take 3 vacations, lease a new car, and book a trip to Europe. But not time to pay back $27,000? That's not fair," Lydia protested. "You have money. I was struggling." "I had money because I lived below my means and saved it," I replied. "You were struggling because you spent more than you earned. There's a difference." My father was still reading through the documents, working his way back through the stack chronologically. He picked up one of the medical bills, studied it, then set it down and covered his face with both hands. His shoulders shook. "I didn't know," he said, his voice muffled. "Whitney, I didn't know you did this." "I know, Dad," I said. "The surgery fees," he continued, looking up at me with red eyes. "They told me it was covered. They said the insurance had taken care of everything." "I called and told them I was handling it," I explained. "I didn't want you to worry about bills while you were recovering." He made a sound that was half sob, half laugh. $31,000. Jesus, Whitney. My mother finally looked up from the summary page. Her expression was hard to read. Not quite angry, not quite ashamed. Something in between that looked almost like resentment. She slid the stack of papers back across the table toward me, the pages catching slightly on the tablecloth. The movement was deliberate, dismissive. "Your money is family money," she said, her voice cold and controlled. "We're your family. What you give to us isn't something you get to keep score of. That's not how families work." I stared at her, stunned by the audacity of it. Even now, faced with undeniable proof of how much I'd sacrificed, she was finding a way to make it not count. "You don't get to throw this in our faces, like we owe you something," she continued. "This is what family does. We help each other." "Help goes both ways, Mum," I said quietly. "We've given you plenty," she snapped. "We raised you. We gave you a home. You told me I was an accident," I interrupted, and her mouth snapped shut. "When I was 12 years old, I heard you tell Aunt Linda that you only wanted one child, that I was an accident you learned to live with." The silence that followed was absolute. Even Lydia looked shocked. My mother's face flushed red. "You were eavesdropping." "I was sick," I said. "I came home early from school, and I heard my mother tell someone that she wished I'd never been born." My mother's jaw tightened. For a moment, I thought she might actually acknowledge what she'd said all those years ago, might offer some explanation or apology that could begin to heal the wound that had never closed. But instead, her eyes hardened. "You're being selfish," she said, her voice sharp, "dragging up things from decades ago, twisting them to make yourself the victim. This whole display tonight," she gestured at the papers on the table, "it's calculated. You did this to make us feel guilty." I felt like I'd been slapped. "Calculated?" "Yes," my mother said, sitting up straighter, her composure returning as she found her footing in this familiar territory of turning my feelings into character flaws. "You kept track of every dollar saved, every receipt, built this whole case against us like we're criminals. That's not love. That's manipulation." "I kept records because I'm a financial advisor," I said, my voice shaking now. "I keep records of everything. That's my job." "No," my mother corrected. "You kept them because you wanted to use them against us someday. You wanted this moment. You wanted to make us feel small." I couldn't breathe. She was taking 5 years of sacrifice, of quietly helping them through every crisis and reframing it as a scheme, as something vindictive I'd planned all along. "I helped you because you needed help," I said, "because you're my family." "Did you?" Lydia interjected, and I turned to look at my sister. She'd recovered from her initial shock and now wore an expression I'd seen before, the one she used when she was about to justify something indefensible. "Or did you help because it made you feel superior, because you could hold it over us?" "I never mentioned any of it," I said, my voice rising. "Not once. I never asked for thanks or recognition or—" "Exactly," Lydia interrupted. "You never mentioned it because you were saving it. Saving it for a moment like this when you could throw it in our faces and make yourself look like the saint and the rest of us look like ungrateful users." I stared at my sister, this person I'd bailed out of financial disaster 2 years ago, who was now accusing me of helping her as some kind of power play. The audacity of it was breathtaking. "You told everyone you overcame that debt yourself," I said quietly. "You posted about it on Facebook. You gave advice to people about financial discipline. You took credit for something I did." "I did change my habits," Lydia shot back. "I stopped spending recklessly. The fact that you paid off the debt doesn't mean I didn't grow from the experience." "You grew on my dime," I said, "and you never even said thank you." "Because you never wanted thanks," Lydia said, her voice taking on that condescending tone she used when she thought she'd won an argument. "You wanted this. You wanted to feel morally superior. You wanted to be able to say you were better than me." My mother nodded along with Lydia's words, and I realised they were tag-teaming me. They were creating a narrative where my silence about helping them was proof of ulterior motives rather than evidence of humility or discretion. "That's not true," I said, but my voice sounded weak even to my own ears. "Isn't it?" my mother asked, leaning forward. Think about it, Whitney. You've always been like this, always standing apart, always watching, never fully engaging with this family. I've known it since you were a child. Because you made me stand apart, I said. Because nothing I did was ever good enough. No, my mother said, and her voice dropped to something quieter and more cutting. Because you were always cold. I've always known it. Even when you were little, there was something distant about you, something missing. The words hit me like physical blows. Cold, distant, missing. I never felt you truly loved this family. My mother continued, and I saw something almost like satisfaction in her eyes at finally saying what she'd apparently thought for years. You were always holding something back, going through the motions, but never really connecting. Even now with all this, she gestured at the papers. It's not about love. It's about keeping score, about proving something. I couldn't speak. My throat had closed completely. She had taken 35 years of me trying desperately to earn her love to be seen to matter, and told me I was the one who'd been withholding, that my love had never been real to begin with. Mum, my father said quietly, but she ignored him. You want me to thank you, and my mother asked. Fine, thank you for the money, Whitney. Thank you for keeping such meticulous records of your generosity. Thank you for reminding us that apparently we owe you everything and you owe us nothing. I stood up. I didn't make the decision consciously. My body just moved, pushing the chair back, needing to get away from this table. And these people who could look at nearly $200,000 in documented sacrifice and call it manipulation. I'm leaving, I said. Of course you are, my mother replied. Running away. That's what you do, isn't it, when you don't get the reaction you wanted? I grabbed my purse from the floor, my hand shaking so badly I almost dropped it. I didn't look at any of them. I couldn't. If I looked at my mother's face right now, at the cold certainty in her eyes that I was the problem, that I'd always been the problem, I might shatter completely. Whitney, wait, my father said, and I heard his chair scrape against the floor. Let her go, my mother said. She's made her point. She's shown us what she thinks of us. I was halfway to the door when my father's voice rang out louder than I'd ever heard it. No. I stopped, turned around. My father was standing. Not just standing, but blocking my mother's path as she'd started to rise from her chair. His hands were shaking, but his jaw was set in a way I'd never seen before. That's enough, he said, looking down at my mother. You've gone too far. My mother stared up at him, shocked. Robert, sit down. No, he said again. His voice was shaking now, but he didn't move. I've sat down for 20 years. I've stayed quiet while you treated our daughter like she didn't matter. I'm not sitting down anymore. He turned to look at me, and there were tears streaming down his face. She deserves better than this, he said, his voice breaking. She's always deserved better than this. I stood frozen in the doorway, my purse clutched against my chest like a shield staring at my father. He was still standing between my mother and me, this man who'd been silent my entire life, suddenly finding his voice in the one moment I'd needed it most. My mother's face had gone white with fury. Robert, move. No, he said again, and I saw his hands were trembling, but he didn't sit down. He didn't move aside. He just stood there, blocking her, protecting me in a way he never had before. We'll talk about this later, my mother said, her voice tight and controlled, but I could hear the rage underneath it. We'll talk about it now, my father replied. Then he turned to me. Whitney, please don't leave yet. Give me 10 minutes. Just 10 minutes. I wanted to run. Every instinct told me to get out of this house, away from my mother's poison and Lydia's deflection. But something in my father's face stopped me. Desperation, grief, maybe even courage. Okay? I whispered. He walked toward me, moving past my mother, who sat rigid in her chair, and past Lydia, who was staring at her plate as if she could disappear into it. He gestured toward the front door. Outside? I nodded, and followed him out onto the porch. The cool evening air hit my face, and I realized I'd been sweating. My whole body was shaking with adrenaline and exhaustion. We walked down the porch steps into the driveway, far enough from the house that we couldn't be overheard through the windows. My father stood there for a moment, his hands in his pockets, looking up at the sky like he was searching for the right words. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet I had to lean closer to hear him. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm so sorry, Whitney, for all of it, for every year I stayed quiet, for every time I should have stood up for you and didn't." "Dad." "No, let me finish," he interrupted gently. "I've been too weak for too long. Your mother, she's always been strong-willed, dominant, and I told myself it was easier to keep the peace. That intervening would only make things worse. But that was cowardice, and you paid the price for it." Tears were burning behind my eyes. "I just wanted her to see me," I said, my voice breaking. "I just wanted to matter." "You always mattered," my father said fiercely. "God, Whitney, you've always mattered. I knew you were helping us. I knew you sent money. I just didn't know how much." He wiped his face with his palm. $189,000. Jesus, how did you even— "I live very simply," I said, "and I make good money. It wasn't a hardship, not financially." "But it was a hardship in every other way," my father said, "and we never thanked you. I never thanked you. I just let your mother take credit for solving problems you'd solved." We stood in silence for a moment, and I could hear the crickets starting their evening chorus, the normal sounds of a suburban night that felt surreal against the wreckage of what had just happened inside. "Wait here," my father said suddenly. "There's something I need to show you." He went back into the house, and I stood alone in the driveway, hugging myself against the evening chill. Through the dining room window, I could see my mother and Lydia sitting at the table, their heads close together talking. Planning their next move probably, figuring out how to spin this. My father returned a few minutes later, carrying a small metal lockbox, the kind you might keep important documents or emergency cash in. It looked old, the green paint chipped at the corners. "I've kept this hidden in my workshop for the last 5 years, he said, holding it out to me. "I kept hoping you'd never need to see what's inside, but after tonight, after what your mother said to you, I think that time has come." My hands trembled as I took the box. It was heavier than I expected. "What is it?" "Documents, he said. "Things I found over the years. Things I couldn't quite bring myself to confront your mother about, but couldn't throw away either." He pulled a small key from his wallet and handed it to me. "I want you to look through everything. Really look. Because there are things even I didn't want to believe about your mother." I unlocked the box and lifted the lid. Inside were papers neatly organised in folders. I pulled out the first folder and opened it. Bank statements, old ones from over a decade ago. I saw my name at the top Whitney Jordan savings account. "Your grandmother left you money when she died," my father said quietly. "You were 10 years old. $23,000 to be held in trust until you turned 18. I remembered. I remembered my grandmother's funeral. Remembered my mother telling me that Grandma had left me something special for college. I'd been so young the amount had seemed impossibly large. A fortune. "What happened to it?" I asked, though I was starting to suspect I already knew. "Look at the withdrawal history," my father said. I flipped through the statements tracking the balance over the years. It had grown, with interest reaching nearly $26,000 by the time I was 15. And then, in a single transaction dated March 2015, when I was 17 years old, withdrawal 2060 account closed. "I was never told," I whispered. "Your mother said it was being used for family expenses," my father said. "She said you'd agreed to it, that you wanted to help the family. She had me sign off on it because it required both parents' authorization." "I never agreed to anything," I said, my voice hollow. I didn't even know it was being withdrawn." "I know that now," my father said. "But at the time, I believed her. I always believed her." I looked back in the box. There were more folders. I pulled out another one and found financial records from even earlier family tax returns, mortgage documents, credit applications. And then I saw it. A power of attorney form dated 2019 with my name typed at the top. I pulled it out and my blood ran cold. There was a signature at the bottom, supposedly mine, authorizing someone to act on my financial behalf. But I'd never signed this document. I'd never even seen it before. "That's not my signature," I said, holding it up to the porch light to see it better. "I know," my father said quietly. I stared at the signature. It was close. Someone had tried to copy my handwriting, the way I looped my W, and the distinctive way I crossed my T, but it wasn't quite right. The pressure was different. The angle was off. Who signed this? I asked, though I already knew. There was only one person who would have had both the motive and the access to forge my signature. My father looked away, unable to meet my eyes. "I found that in your mother's desk drawer 6 months ago. I've been carrying it around since then, trying to figure out what to do about it." My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the document. A forged power of attorney. That was fraud. That was identity theft. That was criminal. "Dad," I whispered, "this is serious. This is—" "I know," he said. His voice was thick with something that might have been shame or grief or both. "And that's not the only document I found." My father reached back into the lockbox and pulled out another folder, this one thicker than the others. His hands were shaking as he handed it to me. "I found these mixed in with our tax documents," he said. "I thought at first they were finding errors, duplicates maybe, but when I looked closer—" He trailed off, unable to finish. I opened the folder. Inside were loan applications, credit agreements, signature pages from documents I'd never seen before. And on every single one of them was my name, my social security number, my signature, or rather something that was supposed to be my signature. The first was a personal loan application from 2018, $15,000 from a regional bank I'd never done business with. The application listed my employment, my income accurate information, which meant whoever filled this out had access to my personal details. The signature at the bottom looked like mine at first glance, but I could see the differences. The way the J in Jordan swooped too low. The way the N at the end wasn't quite closed. "I never applied for this," I said, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. "Keep looking," my father said quietly. The next document was a credit line agreement from 2019, $12,000. Same forged signature, same accurate personal information. Then another one from 2020, an $8,000 store credit account at a furniture retailer. 3 loans, $35,000, all in my name, all fraudulent. I thought about my credit score, which I checked religiously as part of my professional practice. It was excellent, over 800. These loans must have been paid on time, which meant whoever took them out had been making the minimum payments to avoid damaging my credit and triggering my attention. "There's one more," my father said, and his voice had gone even quieter. "This is the one that made me realize I couldn't ignore it anymore." He pulled out a document that was clipped separately, marked with a yellow sticky note in his handwriting that just said 2021. I unfolded it and my stomach dropped. Home equity line of credit, $55,000. My parents' house used as collateral. 2 signatures required the homeowner and a co-signer with good credit. My mother's signature was at the bottom, and right next to it supposedly mine. "I never signed it," I whispered. "Dad, I swear to you, I never signed this." "I believe you," he said. "I compared it to your real signature on your college loan papers that we co-signed when you were 18. It's not the same." $55,000, secured against their house. If they defaulted, the bank could foreclose, and I would be liable for the debt because my name was on it as co-signer. Except I'd never agreed to it, never even known it existed. "This is identity theft," I said, and hearing the words out loud made them real in a way they hadn't been seconds before. "This is fraud. This is—" I couldn't finish the sentence. "Criminal," my father said, completing my thought. "I know." I looked back at the house where my mother was probably still sitting at that dining room table, probably still self-righteous in her anger at me for daring to document the money I'd given them. All this time, she hadn't just been taking the money I'd offered. She'd been taking more, taking what I didn't even know I had. "I need to check something," I said, pulling out my phone. My hands were shaking so badly, I almost dropped it. I opened my credit monitoring app, the one I'd subscribed to years ago, as a precaution. I'd checked it just last month, done my regular review. Everything had been fine, but now I knew what to look for. I pulled up my full credit report, scrolling past my car loan and credit cards looking for anything unfamiliar. And there they were. 3 accounts I'd never opened. Personal loan, credit line, retail account, all showing as current, all with payment histories that looked perfectly normal. Someone had been maintaining them, keeping them active, making sure they didn't raise any red flags. But there was more. My credit report showed inquiries, requests to view my credit history. 12 of them over the past 5 years. Banks I'd never contacted. Lenders I'd never approached. Each inquiry knocked a few points off your credit score temporarily, but they'd been spaced out enough that the impact had been minimal. Someone had been shopping my credit around for years. I switched to my email, searching for anything from these banks. At first I found nothing, but then I remembered I'd created folders for suspected spam years ago, automated filters that sent certain types of emails directly to trash, promotional offers, account notifications from institutions I didn't bank with. I went to my spam folder and searched for loan approval. 47 results. I searched for account opened. 63 results. I searched for document signed. 89 results. Email after email, all automatically filtered away, all telling me about financial activity I'd never initiated. Account openings, password resets, document signatures, verification codes, a digital paper trail of someone accessing my financial life without my knowledge. One email caught my eye, from 2021, the same year as the home equity loan. Subject line: your signature confirmation, HELOC application approved. I opened it. The email thanked me for my electronic signature on the home equity line of credit application and confirmed that the $55,000 credit line had been approved. It included a customer service number to call with any questions. My father was watching me, seeing the horror unfold across my face as I pieced it together. "She's been doing this for years," I said. "Not just the transfers from my account. She's been opening loans in my name, forging documents, accessing my accounts." I looked at the customer service number in the email. It was after 8 p.m, but it was listed as a 24-hour hotline. I called it without thinking, without planning what I would say. The line rang twice before someone answered. "First National Bank Customer Service. This is David speaking. How can I help you?" "I need to verify a home equity loan." I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Account holder, Whitney Jordan." "Certainly. Can I have the last 4 digits of your social security number?" I gave them to him. "Thank you. And what can I help you with regarding your home equity line of credit?" "I need to know who the co-signers are on the account," I said. There was a pause while he looked something up. "Your account shows 2 authorised parties. The primary signer is Margaret Jordan, and you're listed as the co-signer. The account was opened in April 2021. The world seemed to tilt. Hearing it confirmed by a stranger by an official bank representative made it undeniable. "And both signatures were verified?" I asked. "Yes, ma'am, Both signatures were authenticated at the time of application. The loan was approved based on your combined credit profiles. "Thank you," I said quietly and ended the call. I looked at my father and he looked back at me with an expression of profound sorrow. "Margaret Jordan," I said. "The primary signer was Margaret Jordan." My mother, the woman who'd raised me, the woman who'd just called me cold and manipulative, the woman who'd told me I'd never truly loved this family. She'd been committing identity theft against her own daughter for at least 5 years. I don't remember driving home. One moment I was standing in my parents' driveway, my father hugging me goodbye with the lockbox clutched between us, and the next, I was sitting in my dark apartment, the box on my coffee table staring at nothing. The clock on my microwave said 11:47 p.m, nearly midnight. The entire evening felt like a fever dream. The dinner, the confrontation, my mother's cruelty, my father's confession, and finally, the undeniable evidence that my own mother had been stealing my identity for years. I sat on my couch without turning on the lights, letting the darkness wrap around me like a blanket. Through my living room window, I could see the city lights in the distance, other people's lives continuing normally while mine had just imploded. My phone buzzed, a text from my father. "Please be safe. I'm here if you need to talk. I'm so sorry." I didn't respond. I didn't know what to say. Sorry didn't fix this. Sorry didn't undo years of fraud. Sorry didn't give me back the inheritance my grandmother had left me, or the clean credit history I should have had, or the childhood where I'd been valued instead of tolerated. I opened the lockbox again, pulling out documents one by one, spreading them across my coffee table. In the dim light coming through the window, they looked like evidence at a crime scene, which I supposed they were. The forged power of attorney, the loan applications I'd never signed, the bank statements showing my grandmother's money disappearing into my mother's accounts, all of it documented, dated, impossible to deny. I thought about all the times over the years when my mother had asked me for information. "Just need your social security number for the insurance paperwork, honey." "Can you give me your birth date and address? I'm updating our family records." "What's your driver's license number? Just for the emergency contact form." At the time, they'd seemed like reasonable requests, the kind of information families shared. I'd given it freely because I trusted her. Because despite everything, despite the favoritism and the dismissals, and the constant feeling of being less than she was still my mother, she'd weaponized that trust, turned it into access, used my love against me in the most calculated way possible. I pulled my laptop onto my knees, the screen's glow harsh in the darkness. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I knew what I needed to do professionally. I advised clients on fraud protection all the time. The steps were clear. Freeze your credit file, a police report, contact an attorney, dispute the fraudulent accounts. But this wasn't a client. This was my mother. If I pursued this, there would be no coming back from it. No family dinners, however toxic they'd been. No Christmas mornings or birthday calls. Lydia would never speak to me again. My mother would probably hate me for the rest of her life. Even my father, who tried to help, would be caught in the middle of a legal battle that could destroy what was left of our family. But if I didn't pursue it, what did that say about me? That I'd let someone steal from me, defraud me, commit federal crimes against me just because we shared DNA? That I valued their approval more than my own dignity? I'd already lost myself years ago, I realised. I'd lost myself the first time I'd paid a bill in silence, hoping it would make them love me. The first time I'd accepted being invisible because speaking up would cause conflict. The first time I'd told myself that maybe if I just gave a little more, sacrificed a little more, they'd finally see my worth. I'd been choosing them over myself for 35 years. And they'd never chosen me once. I typed into the search bar, identity theft lawyer near me. The cursor blinked at the end of the search terms. My finger hovered over the enter key. One click and I'd cross a line I could never uncross. One click and I'd be admitting that my mother was a criminal, not just a difficult parent. One click and I'd be choosing myself. I sat there for what felt like hours, my finger trembling over that key, unable to press it, but unable to close the laptop either. My phone buzzed again. Not a text this time. An email notification. I glanced at it, expecting another spam message, another promotional offer. But the subject line made my blood run cold. Credit alert, new inquiry on your account. I opened the email with shaking hands. It was from my credit monitoring service, the one that tracked every time someone accessed my credit report. Alert, a new credit inquiry has been made in your name. Lender, Community First Credit Union. Loan type personal loan, amount $25,000, status pending. The timestamp on the inquiry was 2:47 a.m., less than an hour ago. She was doing it again. Right now, even after being confronted, even after I'd left with evidence of her fraud, my mother was trying to open another loan in my name. I clicked through to my credit monitoring portal, my heart pounding. There it was, a hard inquiry from Community First Credit Union, logged less than an hour ago. The application was still pending, which meant it hadn't been approved yet, which meant I could still stop it. I found the credit union's fraud hotline and called it immediately. A sleepy-sounding representative answered after 4 rings. I need to report a fraudulent loan application, I said, my voice surprisingly steady. Someone is trying to open a personal loan in my name without my authorization. Let me pull up the application, the representative said. I heard typing. Whitney Jordan. Yes? The application was submitted electronically at 2:47 a.m. tonight. Can you verify your social security number and address? I gave her the information, and she confirmed the details matched the application. I need this application blocked immediately, I said. I did not submit it. This is identity theft. I'm placing a fraud alert on the application right now, she said. It will be denied and flagged. I'm also sending you a formal fraud report to fill out. You'll need to file this with your local police department. Thank you, I said, and ended the call. I looked at my laptop, still open to that search page. The cursor was still blinking after identity theft lawyer near me. This time, I didn't hesitate. I pressed enter. The search results loaded page after page of law firms, attorneys who specialized in family fraud, identity theft, recovery, financial crimes. I opened 3 of them in new tabs, reading their intake information, their case, success rates, their contact forms. And then I started typing. My name is Whitney Jordan. I'm 35 years old and I need help. My mother has been stealing my identity for at least 5 years. She's forged my signature on multiple loan applications, stolen my inheritance, and opened fraudulent accounts in my name. I have documentation. I have evidence. And as of 3 hours ago, she tried to do it again. I need legal representation and I need it immediately. I copied the message and pasted it into all 3 contact forms. Then I hit submit on each one. The emails whooshed away into the digital void, and I closed my laptop. I'd made my choice. I didn't sleep. I sat on my couch watching the sky slowly lighten through my living room window, the lockbox of evidence beside me, my phone clutched in my hand. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my mother's face across that dinner table, heard her calling me cold and manipulative, saw her sliding those financial documents back to me like they meant nothing. At 6:15 a.m., my phone rang. I answered before the second ring. Ms. Jordan? A woman's voice asked. This is Patricia from the Chen and Associates law firm. I'm calling regarding the inquiry you submitted last night about identity theft representation. My heart started pounding. Yes, that's me. Mr. Chen reviewed your case summary this morning and asked me to contact you immediately. He'd like to meet with you today if possible. He said to tell you this is exactly the kind of case he specializes in, and he believes he can help you. Today, I repeated. He's had a cancellation at 2 p.m. Would that work for you? I thought about my calendar. I had client meetings scheduled, portfolio reviews, a presentation I was supposed to give at 3. But I also had a mother who tried to defraud me at 3 a.m. I'll be there, I said. She gave me the address, a downtown office building I passed every day on my way to work, and told me to bring all documentation I had. I assured her I would and ended the call. Over the next few hours, 2 more attorneys called with similar messages, but Marcus Chen had been the first to respond, and something about the urgency in his assistant's voice told me he understood the severity of what I was dealing with. I called in sick to work. It was the first sick day I'd taken in over 2 years. Then I spent the morning organising the documents from the lockbox, adding them to the financial records I'd compiled for the dinner confrontation. I created a timeline, a spreadsheet, a summary of every fraudulent transaction I'd found. By the time I left for the attorney's office, I had a portfolio that would have made my professional training instructor proud. Chen and Associates was on the 14th floor of a glass and steel building that smelled like expensive coffee and air conditioning. The receptionist led me to a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. I sat down, arranging my documents on the table in front of me, and waited. Marcus Chen arrived 5 minutes later. He was younger than I expected, maybe mid-40s with silver, starting to show at his temples, and sharp, intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He carried a yellow legal pad and sat across from me with the focused attention of someone who took his work very seriously. "Ms. Jordan," he said, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming on such short notice. I read your intake summary last night, and I have to tell you, your case is both extremely clear-cut and deeply concerning." "Concerning," I repeated, "because this isn't just family drama," he said, flipping open his notepad. "This is federal crime, identity theft, fraud, forgery, multiple counts, multiple years. And the fact that it's ongoing, that your mother attempted another application just hours after being confronted, that tells me she either doesn't understand the legal consequences of what she's doing or she doesn't care." I pulled out the first document. My grandmother's savings account. $26,000 withdrawn in 2015 without my knowledge. He examined it, made notes. "You were a minor at the time?" 17. "The account was in trust until I turned 18. Both parents would have needed to authorise the withdrawal," he said. "Did your father know?" "He says my mother told him I'd agreed to it." "I didn't." Chen made more notes. "That's fraud, possibly embezzlement from a minor's trust account. Continue." I showed him the forged power of attorney, the loan applications with false signatures, the home equity line of credit. With each document, his expression grew more serious. "This is systematic," he said. "This isn't someone making a one-time mistake or a desperate decision in a crisis. This is years of calculated fraud." He looked up at me. "You understand that if we pursue this fully, your mother could face criminal prosecution. Identity theft is a federal felony. Depending on the amounts involved and the number of incidents, she could be looking at significant prison time." The word prison hit me like a physical blow. I'd known this was serious, had known it was criminal, but hearing it stated so plainly made it real in a way it hadn't been before. "I don't want her to go to prison," I said quietly. "Then what do you want?" Chen asked, his voice gentle but direct. I thought about that question. What did I want? I wanted my mother to acknowledge what she'd done. I wanted her to admit she'd been wrong about me, that I'd never been the cold, calculating one in this relationship. I wanted my family to see me, to really see me. But more than that, I wanted it to stop. I wanted to know that when I went to sleep at night, my mother wasn't using my identity to open loans. I wanted to know my credit wouldn't be destroyed by someone else's decisions. I wanted boundaries that actually meant something. "I want justice," I said finally. "I want my money back. I want the fraudulent accounts closed and my credit cleared. I want legal protection so this can't happen again." "Oh, that's all very reasonable," Chen said, "and achievable through civil litigation. But there's another consideration. Do you want her to know you're prepared to go further if necessary?" I met his eyes. "What do you mean?" "I mean, we can start with a cease and desist letter," he explained. "It's a legal notice that informs your mother we have evidence of her fraud and demands she immediately stop all unauthorized use of your identity. It puts her on notice that you have legal representation and documentation. It makes clear that while you're not immediately pursuing criminal charges, you have grounds to do so." "A warning shot," I said. "Exactly. It gives her a chance to cooperate to potentially settle this civilly without involving law enforcement." "But," he paused, making sure I was listening, "once we send that letter, there's no going back. Your mother will know you've lawyered up. Your family will know you're serious. The dynamic will shift permanently." I thought about my father, who'd given me the evidence knowing what it would mean. I thought about Lydia, who'd watched me walk out of that house and hadn't said a word. I thought about my mother, who'd tried to defraud me just hours after I confronted her about doing exactly that. "I want them to know I know everything," I said, my voice steady now. "I want them to know this stops now, or there will be consequences they can't ignore." Chen nodded slowly. "Then we draft the letter today. I'll have it ready for your review by tomorrow morning, and we can send it by the end of the week." "How long do I have to decide if I want to file charges?" I asked. "The statute of limitations varies by offence, but you have time. Years in most cases. But I'd recommend we move forward with freezing your credit immediately and documenting everything going forward. If she tries again, if there's any contact that feels threatening or manipulative, I want to know about it." "Understood," I said. Chen stood and extended his hand again. "One more thing, Ms. Jordan. Be prepared for your mother's response. In my experience with family fraud cases, confrontation brings one of two reactions, either genuine remorse and cooperation, or escalation and retaliation. You need to be ready for either." I shook his hand, thinking about my mother's face when she'd called me cold, when she'd dismissed 35 years of trying to earn her love. "I'm ready," I said. Marcus Chen emailed me the draft letter 2 days later. I read it 3 times, sitting at my desk at work. Between client meetings, my office door closed. The language was professional and precise, laying out the documented evidence of identity theft, fraud, and forgery. It demanded immediate cessation of all unauthorized use of Whitney Jordan's personal information and warned of civil and criminal consequences should the behavior continue. It gave my mother 14 days to respond through legal counsel. Seeing it in writing in formal legal language made everything feel terrifyingly real. This was happening. I was doing this. I approved the letter that afternoon. Chen said he'd send it via certified mail and email the following morning, ensuring there would be documented proof of delivery. But before it went out, I needed to see my father. I called him from my car that evening, sitting in my office parking garage, after everyone else had left for the day. He answered on the first ring as if he'd been waiting. "Can we meet?" I asked. "Somewhere private, not at the house." "Of course," he said immediately. "Where?" We agreed on a coffee shop halfway between our homes, the kind of anonymous chain restaurant where no one would recognize us or care about our conversation. I arrived first and chose a booth in the back corner away from the windows. When my father walked in 10 minutes later, he looked like he'd aged a decade since I'd seen him in the driveway with that lockbox. His shoulders were hunched, his face drawn. He slid into the booth across from me, not bothering to order anything. "Your mother knows you went to a lawyer," he said without preamble. "She found the business card you left in the driveway." I hadn't realized I'd dropped Chen's card. It must have fallen out when I was gathering the documents. "What did she say?" "She's furious," he said. "She says you're being vindictive, that you're trying to destroy the family." He paused. "She also tried to open another credit card in your name yesterday." I stopped her. My stomach clenched. How? I threatened to leave, he said quietly. I told her if she didn't stop, I'd file for divorce and testify against her in court. She called me a traitor. I pulled out a folder from my bag and slid it across the table. Dad, I need you to see everything. Not just what was in the lockbox, everything I've found since then. He opened the folder slowly and I watched his face as he went through the pages. The full credit report showing accounts I'd never opened. The timeline of fraudulent activity. The loan documents with forged signatures. The calculation of total damages, nearly $240,000, when you included the inheritance theft, the fraudulent loans, and the money I'd given voluntarily that had been obtained through manipulation. $240,000, he whispered, staring at the summary page. That's what I can document, I said. There might be more I haven't found yet. His hands were shaking. He set the papers down and covered his face. I knew she was difficult, he said, his voice muffled. I knew she was controlling. I knew she played favourites, but I didn't know she was criminal. Dad, she did something similar to me, he interrupted, looking up. His eyes were wet. 15 years ago, she opened a business credit line in my name without telling me, used it to renovate the house. $40,000 in debt I didn't know about until the collection call started. I stared at him. You never told me. I was ashamed, he said, and scared. She told me if I made a big deal about it, she'd tell everyone I was an irresponsible husband who couldn't manage money. She said she'd leave me and take you girls and make sure I never saw you again. He wiped his eyes with his napkin. I was too weak to fight back. I just paid it off quietly and tried to forget about it. That's not weakness, Dad. That's abuse. It's weakness when you let it hurt your children, he said. I saw what she did to you growing up. How she treated you differently than Lydia. How she made you feel invisible. And I told myself I was keeping the peace, but really I was just protecting myself from her anger. He reached across the table and gripped my hand. I'm sorry I let that weakness hurt you too. You gave me the lockbox, I said. You helped me see the truth. 20 years too late, he said bitterly. My phone started ringing. I glanced at the screen, my mother. I declined the call. It rang again immediately. Declined again. Then it started buzzing with texts. I turned the phone face down on the table. She knows we're talking, my father said. Let her know, I replied. The cease and desist letter goes out tomorrow morning. She'll have it by end of day. My father nodded slowly. What happens then? She has 14 days to respond through an attorney. If she doesn't, or if she tries anything else, we move to the next phase, which is filing a police report, pursuing criminal charges, freezing her assets, whatever Chen recommends to protect me. We sat in silence for a moment, both of us processing what was coming. The end of our family as we'd known it, however dysfunctional it had been. My phone started ringing again, and again. I picked it up and saw 17 missed calls in the last 10 minutes, all from my mother. Then, a voicemail notification appeared. She's relentless, I muttered. She's scared, my father said. She knows she's losing control. Against my better judgment, I played the voicemail on the speaker so my father could hear. My mother's voice came through high-pitched and frantic. Whitney, I need to see you now. This is important. It's about your father's health. Something's wrong. I think he's having symptoms again. His chest pain is back. I need you to come to the house right now. Please, Whitney. I know you're angry, but this is serious. Your father needs you. The message ended. My father and I looked at each other across the table. Your chest pain, I asked. Is non-existent, he said flatly. My last cardiology appointment was 2 weeks ago. Everything is fine. She's lying. But even knowing it was manipulation, even recognizing it as the transparent tactic it was, I felt my resolve waver. What if she wasn't lying? What if something really was wrong and I ignored it because I was too angry to care? My phone rang again. My mother's name flashed on the screen. I stared at it, my finger hovering over the answer button, torn between what I knew was right and what 35 years of conditioning told me I should do. Don't answer it, my father said, watching my face. That's what she wants. She wants you off balance and afraid. But what if something really is wrong? I said, hating how weak my voice sounded. Then I'll go to the house, he said firmly. You stay here. You don't need to subject yourself to her manipulation. I looked at him, this man who'd been silent for so long and was now trying to protect me. No, I said, making a decision. We'll both go. Together. And she can say whatever she needs to say with both of us there. Whitney, I need to do this, Dad. I need to show her that this doesn't work anymore, that I'm not the same person who'll come running every time she creates a crisis. 20 minutes later, we pulled up to my parents' house. Both our cars in the driveway a united front. My hands were shaking as I walked up the porch steps, but my father's steady presence beside me kept me grounded. I didn't knock. I used my key, something I realised I might not have the right to do much longer, and walked in. My mother was in the living room, and I had to admit she'd staged it well. She was sitting on the couch with a blanket around her shoulders, despite the warm evening tissue box beside, her eyes red and swollen from crying. When she saw me, she stood up quickly, the blanket falling to the floor. "Thank God," she said, rushing toward me. "Whitney, your father is standing right here," my father said, stepping into the house behind me. "Perfectly fine." My mother's face flickered with something, annoyance maybe, or calculation before the mask of concern slid back into place. "You don't look fine. You're pale. Have you been having pain?" "I've been having stress," he said flatly. "Stress from living with someone who commits crimes and then lies to cover them up." "How dare you?" my mother hissed, her concerned facade cracking. "How dare I?" my father repeated. "Margaret, you tried to open a credit card in our daughter's name 2 days ago, after being confronted about years of fraud, after she left here with evidence. You tried again." "You need to stop," he interrupted. "That's what you need to do." The sound of footsteps on the stairs made us all turn. Lydia appeared wearing yoga pants and an oversized sweater, her hair in a messy bun. She must have been upstairs the whole time. "What's going on?" she asked, though her tone suggested she knew exactly what was going on. "Your sister is trying to destroy this family," my mother said, pointing at me. "She's hired a lawyer. She's threatening to have me arrested, all over money that was used for family expenses." "All over identity theft," I corrected. "All over fraud and forgery and crimes that could send you to prison." "See," my mother said to Lydia. "See how cold she is. Her own mother could go to prison and she doesn't even care." Lydia looked at me and I saw something complicated in her expression. Concern maybe, or fear about what my actions might mean for her. "Whitney, is that really necessary? I mean, yes, Mum made some mistakes, but sending her to prison, that's extreme." "I'm not sending her anywhere," I said. "Her actions have consequences. I'm just refusing to protect her from them anymore." "Dad could die from the stress of this," Lydia said, and I realised she was reading from the same script my mother had written. "His heart can't take this kind of conflict. Is money really worth more than family?" The old Whitney would have crumbled at those words. The old Whitney would have apologised, backed down, found a way to make everyone comfortable again, even if it meant sacrificing herself. But I wasn't that person anymore. "If you actually cared about Dad's health," I said, looking directly at my mother, "you wouldn't use it as a weapon to manipulate me into accepting abuse." "Abuse," my mother gasped. "I've never abused you. I gave you a home, raised, you fed. You stole from me," I interrupted. You forged my signature on legal documents. You opened loans in my name without my knowledge or consent. You took my grandmother's inheritance and told me nothing. That's not parenting, that's criminal behavior. I did what I had to do, my mother said, her voice rising. This family needed help. Your father's business was failing. We had medical bills. Lydia needed support. I did what mothers do. I took care of my family. By stealing from your daughter, I asked. By using resources that were available, she shot back. You had good credit. You had money. You weren't using it for anything important. It wasn't yours to take, I said. My father had been quiet, but now he stepped forward. Don't drag me into this, Margaret. Don't use my health or my business or anything else to justify what you did. Whitney is right. You need to stop using me as a weapon. My mother whirled on him. You're taking her side after everything I've done for this family, after all the years I've held us together, while you failed at business after business. You held us together by lying and stealing. My father said, his voice shaking but firm. That's not strength. That's desperation masquerading as control. My mother's tears stopped. Just stopped, like someone had flipped a switch. Her face hardened into something I'd never seen before, pure undiluted rage mixed with something that looked almost like fear. You don't understand anything, she hissed, looking between my father and me. Neither of you understand what I've been dealing with, what I've been trying to protect you from. Protect us from what? I asked. I did what I had to do because... Her voice broke, and for the first time the emotion seemed genuine, not performed, real. Because I didn't have a choice. The room went silent. Even Lydia looked confused. What are you talking about? My father asked quietly. My mother's hands were shaking. She looked cornered like an animal backed into a place with no escape. And when she spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. I'm sick. The word hung in the air like a bomb that hadn't quite detonated yet. I stared at my mother, trying to process what she'd just said. Sick, I repeated. What do you mean, sick? My mother's face crumpled, but she didn't elaborate. She just shook her head and turned away, walking toward the kitchen. My father followed her, and I heard their voices raised behind the closed door, muffled but intense. Lydia looked at me, genuine confusion on her face. Did you know about this? No, I said. I don't know anything. We stood there awkwardly for a moment before my father emerged from the kitchen alone. His face was ashen. I think you should go, he said quietly. Both of you. Your mother needs to rest. Dad, what is she talking about? I asked. Not now, Whitney, please. I'll call you later. I promise I'll explain everything. But right now, she needs space. I wanted to argue, wanted to demand answers, but something in my father's expression stopped me. He looked devastated. Whatever my mother had meant by sick, it was serious enough to shake him to his core. I left Lydia trailing behind me to her car. Neither of us spoke. What was there to say? I drove home on autopilot, my mind racing. Was this real? Was my mother actually ill? Or was this just another manipulation tactic, another way to make herself the victim and me the villain? She'd proven herself capable of elaborate deceptions. Why not this? But my father's face. That hadn't looked like he was playing along with a lie. That had looked like genuine anguish. I spent the rest of the evening pacing my apartment, my phone in my hand waiting for my father to call. The cease and desist letter was supposed to go out in the morning. Did this change anything? Should I tell Marcus Chen to wait at 10:47 p.m? My phone finally rang. Dad, can I come over? He asked. His voice sounded wrecked, like he'd been crying. Of course. He arrived 20 minutes later, looking like he'd aged another decade since I'd seen him hours ago. I made him tea he didn't drink, and we sat on my couch in the dim light of my living room lamp. Your mother, he started, then stopped. started again. She was diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment 5 years ago, in 2019. The words didn't make sense at first. Mild cognitive impairment, MCI. I knew what that was. I'd studied enough about financial planning for aging clients to understand the basics. It was a condition that caused memory problems and difficulty with thinking and judgment, often a precursor to Alzheimer's. 5 years, I said slowly. She's had this for 5 years. It started with small things. My father said, forgetting conversations, losing her keys, getting confused about appointments. We both thought it was just stress or normal aging. But then it got worse. She'd repeat herself constantly. She'd forget she'd told me things. She started having trouble managing the household finances. Bills would be paid twice, or not at all. When was she diagnosed? May 2019. We saw a neurologist after she forgot she'd left something on the stove and nearly started a fire. The doctor did cognitive testing brain scans. He said it was MCI, possibly early Alzheimer's, and that it would likely progress. I felt like the floor was tilting beneath me. And you never told me. She made me promise not to. Oh, my father said, his voice breaking. She was terrified of losing her independence, of being seen as weak or incompetent. She made me swear I wouldn't tell you or Lydia. She said if anyone found out, it would destroy her. So you just kept this massive secret while she was committing fraud. I didn't know about the fraud, he said. Not the extent of it. I knew she was struggling with finances, that she was making poor decisions sometimes. I tried to take over more of the money management, but she fought me on it. She needed to feel in control of something. I thought about the timeline. 2019 was when the fraudulent loans had started appearing on my credit report. The forged signatures, the unauthorized transfers. Her judgment was impaired, my father continued. The doctor warned us that people with MCI can have difficulty with executive function, impulse control, understanding consequences. But they can also be very good at hiding it, at appearing completely normal in social situations. So you're saying the fraud was because of the MCI? I asked, my voice harder than I intended. I'm saying it's complicated, my father said. Your mother has always been difficult, controlling. She's always played favourites with you and Lydia. That's not the illness, that's who she is. But the financial crimes, the lack of judgment about consequences, the inability to stop even when confronted, that's gotten worse as the illness has progressed. Has it progressed? I asked. My father nodded, wiping his eyes. 2 years ago, in 2022, she was officially diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's. The doctor said she's probably got another 5 to 10 years before it becomes severe, but the progression is faster than average. She has good days and bad days. Sometimes she's completely herself. Sometimes she forgets entire conversations from an hour ago. I sat there trying to absorb this information, trying to reconcile the mother who'd been so cruel to me at that dinner table with someone whose brain was literally deteriorating. Does this excuse what she did? I asked quietly. No, my father said firmly. It explains some of it maybe, but it doesn't excuse 35 years of making you feel invisible. It doesn't excuse stealing from you. Illness can explain impaired judgment, but it doesn't create cruelty where none existed before. That was the question I'd been circling, the one I'd been afraid to ask. Does her illness explain the fraud, or was she always this person, and the illness just removed her ability to hide it? The doctor said something once, my father continued. He said that Alzheimer's doesn't change your fundamental personality in the early stages. It just removes the filter. It makes you more of what you already were. He looked at me. Your mother has always been obsessed with control, with appearances, with Lydia being perfect. The illness didn't create those things. It just made her unable to manage them in a healthy way. Why are you telling me this now? I asked, because you deserve to know the truth. All of it. And because... He hesitated. Because when you pursue legal action, this is going to come up. Her attorney will use it as a defense. My client has a degenerative brain condition that impairs judgment, and it will muddy everything. He was right. I could already see how it would play out in court. A sympathetic elderly woman with Alzheimer's versus an ungrateful daughter seeking revenge. Never mind the years of favoritism before the diagnosis. Never mind the calculated fraud. Does Lydia know? I asked suddenly. My father shook his head. Your mother forbade me from telling her. She said Lydia couldn't handle it, that it would destroy her image of your mother as our Shurg, strong and perfect. Your mother only wanted Lydia to see her as she wanted to be seen, not as she actually is. Even the illness was managed with favoritism. Even her vulnerability was something I was allowed to see, but Lydia had to be protected from. What do you want me to do? I asked my father. I want you to do what's right for you, he said. Not what's right for her or for me or for this family. For the first time in your life, I want you to choose yourself. After my father left, I sat in the dark for a long time, my laptop closed on the coffee table, trying to make sense of what I'd just learned. My mother had Alzheimer's, had been sick for 5 years, had been hiding it from everyone, including me, while simultaneously committing fraud in my name. At midnight, I finally opened my laptop and started searching. I needed to understand what mild cognitive impairment and early-stage Alzheimer's actually meant beyond the clinical definition. I needed to know if this changed everything or nothing. I read medical journals, patient advocacy websites, caregiver forums. I learned that MCI caused memory problems, difficulty with complex tasks, impaired judgment about risk and consequences. I learned that people in early stages often had lucid periods where they seemed completely normal, alternating with episodes of confusion or poor decision-making. But I also learned something else. I learned that people with MCI and early Alzheimer's could still manipulate, could still plan, could still execute complex schemes, especially if those schemes were rooted in long-standing patterns of behaviour. The illness impaired their judgment about whether something was a good idea, but it didn't erase their intelligence or their ability to problem solve. One article from a neuropsychologist struck me particularly hard. Alzheimer's disease doesn't create new personality traits. It amplifies existing ones and removes the social inhibitions that normally keep inappropriate behaviours in check. If someone was controlling before diagnosis, they often become more controlling. If they were anxious, they become more anxious. The core personality remains, the filter just dissolves. I read that passage 3 times, feeling something click into place. My mother had always been controlling, had always favoured Lydia, had always made me feel like I wasn't enough. The Alzheimer's hadn't created that. It had just made her unable to hide it behind social niceties and long-term consequence assessment. The fraud might have been enabled by impaired judgment, but the cruelty that had been there all along. I closed my laptop at 2 a.m. and lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Her illness might explain the financial chaos, I thought. The inability to stop even when confronted. The poor impulse control that led to opening another loan application hours after being caught. But it didn't explain 35 years of telling me I wasn't good enough. That had happened while she was completely healthy. That was just who she was. The next morning, I called Marcus Chen before I'd even had coffee. We need to meet, I said when he answered. There's been a development. 2 hours later, I was back in his conference room this time, with a folder full of printed research articles about Alzheimer's and legal capacity. I explained everything my father had told me, watching Chen's expression shift from surprise to thoughtful concern. This complicates things, he said when I finished, but it doesn't eliminate them. That's what I needed to hear, I said. Here's the reality, Chen continued, pulling out his legal pad. Your mother's diagnosis will absolutely come up if we pursue criminal charges. A defense attorney would argue diminished capacity, that she didn't understand the wrongfulness of her actions. Some judges and juries would be sympathetic. "So I just let her get away with it?" I asked, hearing the bitterness in my own voice. "No," Chen said firmly. "But we change our approach. Instead of focusing on punishment, we focus on protection. We pursue civil recovery of the stolen funds, and we petition for legal guardianship." A guardianship. If your mother has been diagnosed with Alzheimer's, she legally shouldn't have unfettered access to financial accounts or the ability to open credit in anyone's name, he explained. Guardianship would give you and your father legal authority to manage her finances, protect her from herself, and ensure she can't continue to commit fraud against you or anyone else. I thought about that. It felt right in a way that criminal prosecution didn't. Not because she deserved to escape consequences, but because the goal wasn't revenge. The goal was safety. "We'd still pursue civil damages for the money she took," Chen continued. "That comes from the estate, not from her personally going to jail. And we'd establish clear legal boundaries that prevent any future fraud. We protect your mother from her own impaired judgment, while also protecting you from further harm." "What about the statute of limitations on the fraud?" I asked. "Most of the incidents are within the time frame," Chen said. "And even if some weren't, we have ongoing harm. She tried to open new accounts as recently as this week. That resets the clock." "Do I need to tell Lydia?" I asked. "About the Alzheimer's?" "That's not my call," Chen said. "But strategically, she should probably know before we file anything. If she finds out through court documents, it's going to create additional conflict." I nodded, dreading that conversation. "There's one more thing I need to check," I said, pulling out my phone. "My dad mentioned my mother's been struggling with medical bills. I want to see what we're looking at." I logged into the family health insurance portal. I'd been added as an authorized user years ago when my father had his surgery, and no one had ever removed my access. I pulled up the claims history for the last 5 years. There were dozens of claims. Neurologist appointments, MRI scans, cognitive testing, medications for memory support. The costs were substantial even with insurance. But one thing caught my eye. Under the long-term care benefits section, there was a recurring payment. $3,000 per month paid to a designated caregiver for in-home care services. The caregiver's name was listed as Lydia Jordan. I stared at the screen, my stomach sinking. $3,000 a month. For how long? I scrolled back through the payment history. The payments had started in January 2021, nearly 4 years ago. 48 months times $3,000, $144,000. "What is it?" Chen asked, seeing my face. "My sister," I said slowly, "has been receiving $3,000 a month since 21 as my mother's primary caregiver." "Is she the primary caregiver?" "My father is," I said. "Lydia doesn't even live with them. She visits maybe twice a month." Chen leaned forward. "That's insurance fraud. If she's claiming caregiver payments without actually providing care, that's illegal." I kept staring at the screen at payment after payment, month after month. My sister had been collecting over $100,000 for caregiving. She wasn't doing while our father did all the actual work. And she'd never mentioned it. Not once. I left Marcus Chen's office with a printout of the insurance payment history and drove straight to Lydia's apartment. I didn't call first. I didn't want to give her time to prepare to construct a story, to find a way to make this my fault somehow. She lived in a renovated loft downtown, the kind with exposed brick and floor-to-ceiling windows that cost $3,000 a month in rent. I'd always wondered how she afforded it on a marketing director's salary, especially after the credit card debt she'd supposedly overcome through discipline. Now I knew. She'd been collecting $3,000 a month in caregiver payments for work she wasn't doing. I pressed the buzzer. No answer. I pressed it again, holding it down this time. "What?" Lydia's voice came through the intercom, annoyed. "It's Whitney. Let me up." "I'm busy." "Let me up. Lydia, or I call the insurance fraud hotline right now and report you. There was a long pause, then the door buzzed open. I took the elevator to the 3rd floor, my anger building with each floor I passed. By the time I reached her door, which she'd left ajar, I was shaking. Lydia was in her living room, still in workout clothes, a green smoothie on her marble countertop. She looked wary, but tried for casual. "What's so urgent?" I pulled out the insurance documents and slapped them on her kitchen island. "You've been collecting caregiver payments for Mum since 2021. Her face went carefully blank. So Dad is her actual caregiver. You visit twice a month if that. This is fraud." "It's not fraud," Lydia said, but her voice was less certain now. "I'm listed as her caregiver. I help coordinate her care. I talk to her doctors. I manage her medications." "You manage her medications?" I repeated. "Dad manages her medications. Dad drives her to appointments. Dad makes sure she eats and takes her pills and doesn't leave the stove on. You cash checks for work you don't do." "I do emotional labour," Lydia shot back. "That counts." "Not for $3,000 a month, it doesn't," I said. $144,000, Lydia. That's how much you've collected for caregiving you aren't providing. She crossed her arms defensively. "Mum wanted me to have it. She set it up that way." "Mum has Alzheimer's," I said. "She's had cognitive impairment since 2019. She's not competent to make those kinds of decisions, and you know it." Something flickered in Lydia's eyes. Surprise that I knew, maybe, or fear about what else I'd figured out. "You knew," I said, the realization hitting me. "You knew about her diagnosis from the beginning." Lydia looked away. "Mum told me in 2020 she made me promise not to tell you." "Why?" "Because she knew you'd use it against her," Lydia said. "She knew you'd try to take control to make decisions for her." "Or maybe she knew I'd stop the fraud," I said. "Maybe she knew I'd put protections in place to keep her from destroying everyone's finances." "She needed help," Lydia said, her voice rising. "Do you have any idea how expensive Alzheimer's treatment is? The medications, the specialists, the cognitive therapy insurance doesn't cover everything. So you decided to help yourself to $3,000 a month." "I decided to help the family," Lydia corrected. "Mum needed money for treatment. Dad was overwhelmed. You weren't helping." "I gave this family $189,000, I shouted. "I paid for everything. Dad's surgery, the mortgage, your credit card debt. Don't you dare tell me I wasn't helping." "You didn't know about Mum's Alzheimer's," Lydia said. "That money wasn't specifically for her treatment." "Because no one told me she was sick. You kept it a secret while using it as an excuse to commit fraud." Lydia's jaw tightened. "It wasn't my idea." "What?" "The identity theft," she said quietly. "Using your information for loans." "That wasn't my idea originally, but when Mum suggested it, I didn't stop her." I felt like I'd been punched in the chest. "She suggested it. Her judgment was impaired," Lydia said, speaking quickly now, like she'd been holding this in and it was finally pouring out. "She couldn't understand why you wouldn't just give us more money directly. She knew you had good credit, that you made decent money. She thought she was just accessing family resources." "That's not how it works," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "That's theft. That's fraud. That's criminal." "I know that now," Lydia said. "But at the time, Mum was so confused, so scared about her diagnosis. She needed money for treatment, and she couldn't think straight about how to get it. I should have stopped her. I know I should have. But you saw an opportunity," I finished for her. "You saw a sick woman with poor judgment and a sister with good credit, and you saw a way to get what you wanted." "That's not fair," Lydia protested, but her voice was weak. "You told her to use my information, didn't you?" I asked. "When she was panicking about money, you suggested using me." Lydia's silence was answer enough. "You set this up," I said, feeling the full weight of the betrayal settle over me. You knew about her illness. You knew her judgment was impaired, and instead of protecting her, instead of getting her proper legal and financial help, you encouraged her to commit crimes because it benefited you. Oh, she would have done it anyway, Lydia said desperately. I was just trying to help her manage it. By collecting caregiver payments you didn't earn, by letting her forge my signature on loans, by taking credit for paying off debt with my money. I shook my head. You weren't helping her, Lydia. You were enabling her, exploiting her. I needed the money, Lydia said, and for the first time her carefully constructed facade cracked completely. Do you think it's easy being the perfect daughter, living up to Mum's expectations every single day? I was drowning financially. The caregiver payments helped me stay afloat. So you committed fraud, I said flatly. So I survived, she shot back. Not all of us can live like monks in studio apartments driving 15-year-old cars. Some of us have standards. Standards you maintained with stolen money. Lydia's face flushed red. You always do this. You always make yourself the victim. Poor Whitney, the invisible daughter. You've been holding this over all of us for years, haven't you? Keeping track of every dollar so you could throw it in our faces someday. What else haven't you told me? I asked coldly. What else are you hiding? Lydia went silent, her lips pressed into a thin line. Lydia, I said, what else? She looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something in her expression that looked almost like defeat, or maybe resignation. The house, she whispered. The word hung between us like an accusation. I felt my chest tighten already, knowing I wasn't going to like what came next. What about the house? I asked, my voice deadly calm. Lydia walked to her couch and sat down heavily, her head in her hands. For a moment, I thought she wasn't going to answer. Then she spoke, her voice muffled. Mum transferred it to me. What do you mean, transferred it to you? The house, Lydia said, looking up. Her eyes were red. In 2020, she signed a quitclaim deed putting the house entirely in my name. I stood frozen, trying to process what she was telling me. The family house, the home our parents had lived in for 30 years. The house that was supposed to be part of our inheritance, split equally between us. She transferred a house worth $500,000 to you, I said slowly, without telling me. She wanted me to have security, Lydia said. She knew I was struggling financially. You were struggling because you spent more than you earned, I interrupted. And instead of helping you learn to budget or manage money responsibly, she gave you a house. It's not that simple, Lydia protested. It's exactly that simple. What about Dad? Did he agree to this? Lydia's silence told me everything I needed to know. He doesn't know, sir, I said, or he didn't agree. Mom handled it, Lydia said quietly. She said Dad had signed off on it, that it was what they both wanted. She forged his signature, I said, just like she forged mine on those loan documents. She committed fraud to give you a house. I didn't know that at the time, but you know it now, I said. And you didn't say anything. You just let me sit at that dinner table while Mum told me I'd never done anything worth being proud of. And the whole time you were sitting on a house transfer that cut me out of my inheritance. Lydia stood up defensive now. You make good money, Whitney. You don't need the house. I needed security. I needed something stable in case... She stopped. In case what? I asked. In case something happens to Mum and Dad, she finished. I don't have what you have. I don't have your career or your savings or your perfect credit score. When they're gone, what will I have? Mum wanted to make sure I'd be okay. What about me? I asked. Didn't Mum want to make sure I'd be okay? You're already okay, Lydia said as if it were obvious. You don't need help. That's not how inheritance works, of course, I said. That's not how family works. You don't get everything just because you claim you need it more. Mum wanted me to have it, Lydia repeated, and I heard the same entitled tone she'd had her entire life. The same assumption that the world owed her things simply because she had always received them. Mum has Alzheimer's, I said. She's had impaired judgment since 2019, and this transfer happened in 2020. She wasn't legally competent to make that decision. The deed was notarized, Lydia argued. It's legal. Notarization doesn't prove mental capacity, I shot back. It just proves someone showed ID and signed a document. If Mum was already showing signs of cognitive impairment, if she'd already been diagnosed with MCI, then she lacked the legal capacity to transfer property. Lydia's face paled. You're going to challenge it. I'm going to do what I should have done years ago, I said. I'm going to protect myself. And apparently, I need to protect Dad too, since Mum forged his signature on a major property transfer, and he didn't even know it. You'll destroy the family, Lydia said, her voice rising. You'll drag all of this through court air, all our dirty laundry, humiliate Mum when she's sick. Mum did this to herself, I interrupted. She made these choices. You made these choices. I'm not responsible for the consequences of your fraud. It's not fraud, Lydia shouted. It's textbook fraud, I said coldly. Insurance fraud for the caregiver payments, identity theft for the loans in my name, forgery for the property transfer, undue influence on a cognitively impaired person, elder exploitation. Should I keep going? Lydia sank back onto her couch and I realised she was crying. Real tears this time, not the performative ones she'd used at the dinner table. I didn't mean for it to go this far, she said. It started small. Mum asked me to help her with some paperwork. Then it was just a little money here and there. Then the caregiver thing seemed like it would help both of us. And the house, she was so insistent. She said she was going to lose everything to medical bills, and she wanted to protect at least one asset for us. For me. You mean for you, I corrected. Not us. You. She said you'd be fine, Lydia said. That you didn't need it like I did. I pulled out my phone and took photos of her apartment, the expensive furniture, the designer artwork on the walls, the view that cost a premium. Evidence of a lifestyle funded by fraud. What are you doing? Lydia asked. Documenting, I said. For my attorney. Whitney, please, Lydia said, standing up. We can fix this. We can work something out. I'll pay back the caregiver money. We can split the house. You had years to do the right thing, I said. Years to tell me the truth. Years to stop Mum from committing crimes. You chose not to. You chose to benefit from it instead. I walked toward the door, but Lydia grabbed at my arm. She's sick, Lydia said desperately. Mum is sick. You can't punish her for things she did when her brain wasn't working right. I pulled my arm free and looked at my sister, this person I'd grown up with, who I'd loved despite everything, who I'd bailed out of debt without a second thought. This isn't about punishing her, I said. This is about protecting myself from both of you. I left her standing in that expensive apartment, hearing her crying behind me as the door closed. I made it to my car before I let myself feel anything. Then, I sat in the parking garage and let the tears come, not for my mother or my sister, but for the family I'd wanted and never had. After 10 minutes, I called Marcus Chen. I have more, I told him when he answered. The house was transferred to Lydia in 2020. Dad's signature was forged, and Lydia's been collecting fraudulent caregiver payments since $144,000. Jesus, Chen muttered. Okay, this changes the scope significantly. We're looking at multiple counts of fraud, potentially elder exploitation charges, against your sister. What do we need to prove Mom lacked capacity when she signed the deed? I asked. Medical records from that time period showing her cognitive state, Chen said. Diagnosis, dates, doctor's notes. Any documentation of impaired judgment. I thought about my father's revelation. The diagnosis had been in 2019, and by 2020, my mother's symptoms would have been progressing. Mum has a neurology appointment, I said, remembering something my father had mentioned in passing. Next week. She sees her neurologist every 6 months. Can you get access to her medical records? Chen asked. I can go with her to the appointment, I said. As family, and I can request her full medical history with her current mental state documented. Do it, Chen said. We need official documentation of her condition, both current and historical. That's what will make or break the property challenge. I ended the call and sat in my car staring at nothing. Next week, I'd just sit in a doctor's office with my mother and get the medical proof I needed to undo one of the greatest betrayals she'd committed against me. The daughter she'd called an accident was about to become her legal guardian. 6 days later, I pulled into the parking lot of the Metropolitan Neurological Centre and sat in my car watching the entrance. My father had texted me that they were running a few minutes late, caught in traffic. I had time to prepare myself, though I wasn't sure what I was preparing for. I thought a lot about this appointment over the past week, about what it meant to gather evidence against my own mother while she was suffering from a degenerative brain disease. Marcus Chen had assured me this was necessary, that documentation was the only way to protect both myself and my mother from further harm. But sitting in that parking lot, I felt like I was betraying her in some fundamental way. Then I remembered the dinner table, the coldness in her eyes when she'd called me manipulative, the way she'd dismissed nearly $200,000 in sacrifices, the decades of being told I wasn't enough. I got out of the car. My father's sedan pulled in 5 minutes later. I watched him help my mother out of the passenger side, steadying her with a hand on her elbow. She looked smaller than I remembered, more fragile. She was wearing a cardigan, despite the warm day, her hair grey at the roots where the dye had grown out. She saw me and stopped walking. What are you doing here? I asked her to come. My father said gently. Family support. I don't need her here, my mother said, but there was less venom in her voice than I'd expected. More confusion. The doctor wants to meet with family members, my father lied smoothly. It's routine. We walked into the building together, this strange trio held together by blood and litigation. The elevator ride to the 3rd floor was silent. In the waiting room, I sat across from my parents and filled out the family member intake form the receptionist handed me, documenting my relationship and my concerns about my mother's financial decision-making. Margaret Jordan, a nurse called after 20 minutes. We all stood. My mother looked at me. You're coming in. If that's okay, I said. She shrugged, which I took as consent, and we followed the nurse back to an examination room. Dr. Patel arrived 10 minutes later, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a matter-of-fact demeanour. She greeted my parents warmly, then turned to me. You must be Whitney, she said, shaking my hand. Your father called ahead to let me know you'd be joining us today. My mother looked at my father sharply. You called ahead. I thought it was important, he said quietly. Dr. Patel sat down and opened her laptop, pulling up my mother's chart. Margaret, we're going to do your standard cognitive assessment today, and then I'd like to talk with your family about some planning considerations. Is that okay with you? I suppose, my mother said, but she was watching me with suspicion. The cognitive assessment took 30 minutes. I watched my mother struggle with tasks that should have been simple, remembering a list of words, drawing a clock face with the hands at specific times, counting backward from 100 by sevens. She got frustrated, angry at herself, then confused about why she was angry. When it was over, Dr. Patel made notes in her chart, her expression neutral. Margaret, I'm going to talk with your family for a few minutes. Is it okay if you wait here? I want to hear what you have to say, my mother said. Of course, Dr. Patel. Dr. Patel agreed. I want to review your current status and the progression we've seen since your diagnosis in 2019. My mother went very still. You told her, she said, looking at my father, then at me. You both know. Yes, I said simply. Margaret was diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment in May 2019. Dr. Patel said, reading from the chart. By 2022, the progression indicated early-stage Alzheimer's disease. Currently, she's in stage 2, which involves moderate memory loss, difficulty with executive function and judgment, and increasing confusion about time and place. How bad is it? I asked. Her memory of long-term events is relatively intact, but short-term memory is significantly impaired. She has good days and bad days. Complex decision-making is compromised. Financial decisions especially, I noted in 2020 that I strongly recommended establishing power of attorney and financial safeguards. Did she agree? I asked, though I already knew the answer. She refused, Dr. Patel said. She insisted she was managing fine and didn't need interventions. My mother was looking down at her hands, her face flushed with humiliation. How much longer until she loses capacity completely? I asked. That varies person to person. Based on the rate of progression so far, I'd estimate she has maybe 5 to 10 years before reaching advanced stages. But the disease is unpredictable. Dr. Patel turned to my mother. Margaret, do you understand why your family is concerned? My mother looked up and her eyes found mine. For a moment there was clarity there, recognition, fear. You're Whitney, right? She asked softly. My younger daughter. The question hit me like a punch. Younger daughter, not the older one, not the disappointment. Younger. Yes, I managed. I am Whitney. I forget sometimes, she admitted, her voice small. I look at pictures and I can't remember which one of you is which. You both look the same to me now. My father's hand found mine under the table, squeezing gently. Mum, I said, and my voice cracked on the word. Do you remember giving Lydia the house? She frowned, confused. What house? Our house, the one you and Dad live in. That's our house, she said. We live there. You signed it over to Lydia in 2020, I said. Do you remember doing that? She looked genuinely bewildered. Why would I do that? I glanced at my father, who looked stricken. She didn't remember. The biggest betrayal, the transfer of property worth nearly $500,000, and she didn't remember doing it. Dr. Patel cleared her throat. This is consistent with the impaired judgment we see in Alzheimer's patients. Financial decisions made during this period may not have been made with full understanding of consequences. After the appointment, Dr. Patel asked to speak with me privately while my mother used the restroom. We stepped into her office. Your father told me about some of the financial issues, she said. The identity theft, the property transfer. I need documentation, I said, for legal purposes. She nodded. I can provide a letter outlining her diagnosis history and current cognitive state for the court. Thank you. There's something else, Dr. Patel said, her voice gentler now. The disease will progress, probably faster than you'd like. You need to establish legal guardianship soon, before she loses all capacity. Not for legal purposes, for her protection. She needs someone to make sure she's not exploited, not put in situations where she can hurt herself or others financially. I understand, I said. It should be you, Dr. Patel added. Based on what your father told me, you're the one with the financial expertise and the willingness to establish boundaries. Your mother needs that right now, even if she can't see it. I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. I left the doctor's office with a folder of medical records and a prescription for compassion I wasn't sure I knew how to fill. 3 days after the neurology appointment, I sat in Marcus Chen's conference room with my father on one side of me and Chen on the other. Across the table sat Lydia, who'd arrived 15 minutes late and refused to make eye contact with anyone. A social worker named Patricia Mendez, who specialised in elder care cases, sat at the end of the table with a notepad. "Thank you all for coming," Chen began. "We're here today to discuss a resolution to the financial issues that have come to light regarding the Jordan family. Whitney has asked me to facilitate this conversation in the hopes of reaching an agreement without court intervention." "This is ridiculous," Lydia muttered. "We're family. We don't need lawyers." "We needed lawyers the moment crimes were committed," I said evenly. "And since those crimes involved me, I get to decide how we handle them." Chen opened a folder and pulled out documents. "Let's review what we know. Margaret Jordan has been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease with documented cognitive impairment since 2019. During the period of her impairment, several financial transactions occurred that are now in question." He laid out the evidence systematically. The forged power of attorney, the identity theft, the fraudulent loans, the caregiver payments, the property transfer, each item documented, dated, quantified. Lydia's face grew paler with each page. "The total damages to Whitney exceed $240,000, Chen continued. "The caregiver fraud amounts to $144,000. The property transfer represents approximately $480,000 in assets improperly transferred." "What do you want?" Lydia asked, looking at me directly for the first time. "To destroy Mum. Put her in jail when she's sick." "I want accountability," I said, "but I'm not going to prosecute a woman with Alzheimer's. That's not justice, that's cruelty." I saw my father's shoulders relax slightly beside me. "Here are my terms," I continued. "First, I'm filing a civil lawsuit against you, Lydia, not Mum, you, for the caregiver fraud and for your role in facilitating the identity theft. You knew about Mum's condition. You encouraged her criminal behaviour. You profited from it. That makes you liable." "I didn't force her to do anything," Lydia protested. "You enabled a cognitively impaired person to commit crimes," Chen said. "That's elder exploitation. It's a serious charge." "Second," I continued, "Dad and I are petitioning for co-guardianship of Mum. She needs legal protection to ensure she can't be exploited by anyone else, including you." "You're taking her away from me?" Lydia asked, her voice rising. "We're making sure someone with legal authority is managing her care and finances," Patricia Mendez interjected gently. "Your mother needs professional oversight. This is standard in cases of cognitive decline." "Third," I said, "the house deed transfer is being challenged. The property will revert to Mum and Dad's names with the understanding that, when they pass, it will be split equally between us as was always intended." "That's my house," Lydia said. "Mom gave it to me." "Mom wasn't competent to give it to you," my father said, speaking for the first time. "And I never agreed to it. My signature was forged. That makes the deed invalid." "Fourth," I continued, "you'll repay the caregiver fraud payments, $144,000, over a reasonable time frame. We can structure a payment plan." "I don't have that kind of money," Lydia said. "Then you'll get a second job, sell your car, downsize your apartment," I said without sympathy. "That's what people do when they owe debts. They sacrifice." "This is insane," Lydia said, standing up. "You're destroying this family. Mum is sick and vulnerable, and you're using it as an opportunity to get revenge for every perceived slight from your childhood." "Sit down, Lydia," my father said, his voice hard. "No," she said, "I won't sit here and listen to this. Whitney has always been jealous of me. She's always resented that Mum and I were close. Now she sees a chance to punish both of us, and she's taking it. I've been silent too long, my father said, standing now to face her. I've watched you take advantage of your mother's illness. I've watched you collect money for care you didn't provide. I've watched you encourage her to commit crimes that benefited you. It stops now. You don't get to judge me, Lydia shot back. You've been just as bad, hiding her diagnosis from Whitney for years, letting Mom do whatever she wanted. You're complicit in all of this. I'm not claiming to be innocent, my father said, but I'm taking responsibility now. That's the difference between us. These are your options, Lydia, Chen said, his voice calm but firm. Accept these terms and we settle this privately, or refuse, and Whitney files criminal complaints for insurance fraud and elder exploitation, and we take everything to court. The choice is yours. Lydia looked around the table at Chen's professional detachment, at Patricia's concerned sympathy, at my father's tired determination at me. Fine, she said suddenly, her voice venomous. But if you do this, Whitney, you'll lose Dad too. You think he's innocent in all this? You think he's your ally? She pointed at our father, her hand shaking. You think Dad is some kind of hero for finally standing up to Mum. He's been hiding things from you for years. He knew exactly what was going on. He knew about every loan, every forged signature. He knew, and he let it happen because he's just as weak and selfish as Mum is manipulative. Lydia, stop, my father said, his voice strained. No, she said, tears streaming down her face now. If I'm going down, everyone's going down. Dad has secrets too. Ask him about the money from his business. Ask him where that really went. Ask him who actually made those payments to Whitney's account when Mum was too confused to work the computer. The room went silent. I looked at my father, whose face had gone completely white. Dad, I said quietly. He sat down heavily, his head in his hands. I need to tell you something, he said. The silence in the conference room was suffocating. My father's hands covered his face, his shoulders hunched as if bracing for a blow. Lydia stood with her arms crossed, a look of grim satisfaction on her face, like she'd just played her final card and knew it was a winning hand. Dad, I said again, gentler this time, what is Lydia talking about? He lowered his hands slowly, and I saw that his eyes were wet. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I knew, he said. Not everything, but more than I admitted to you. My stomach clenched, but I forced myself to stay calm. Knew what? I knew your mother was struggling with impulse control after her diagnosis. I knew she was making financial decisions that didn't make sense, and I knew she'd accessed your accounts more than once. You knew she was stealing from me. I asked, the words catching in my throat. I didn't know the extent, he said quickly. I thought it was just the monthly transfers, the ones you'd set up. I didn't know about the forged signatures or the fraudulent loans until you showed me the lockbox. But I knew she'd asked you for your banking information. I knew she sometimes logged into your accounts, and I didn't stop it. Why not? I asked. My father looked at me, and the pain in his eyes was so raw it hurt to witness. Because I was trapped. Every time I tried to confront her, every time I tried to take control of our finances, or suggest she stop asking you for money, she threatened to leave me. She threatened divorce, Marcus Chen asked, making notes. Not just divorce, my father said. She threatened to cut off all contact with both of you girls. She said if I tried to take control from her, if I made her look incompetent or weak, she'd make sure I never saw my daughters again. She'd tell you I was abusive, that I'd been controlling her, that I was the problem. He wiped his face with his palm. And I was terrified, he continued, terrified that if I pushed too hard, she'd actually do it, that she'd poison you against me, that I'd lose everyone, so I stayed quiet. I let her make decisions I knew were wrong because I was too scared to fight her. That's not the same as participating, I said, though my voice shook. That's not the same as what she did, what Lydia did. Isn't it? Lydia interjected bitterly. He knew what was happening and did nothing. That makes him complicit. No, I said, turning to face her. It makes him a victim too. There's a difference between being manipulated by someone and actively choosing to exploit that manipulation for personal gain. He made choices, Lydia insisted. He chose to protect himself instead of protecting you. He was being abused, Patricia Mendez said quietly. It was the first time she'd spoken in several minutes. What you're describing, the threats, the isolation, the fear of losing access to your children, that's textbook coercive control. Your mother was abusing your father emotionally and psychologically. My father let out a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. I kept telling myself I was keeping the peace, that intervening would only make things worse. But really, I was just protecting myself from her anger. Dad, I said, reaching across the table to take his hand. When did you try to stop her? Multiple times? He said. In 2020, when I found out about the first loan in your name, I confronted her. We had the biggest fight of our marriage. She told me if I said anything to you, she'd tell you I was the one who'd taken out the loan, that I'd been stealing from you for years and she had just discovered it. She said she'd make you believe it was all me. And you believed her? I asked. She was very convincing, he said, and she was already starting to get confused about facts. I was terrified that in her confusion she might actually start to believe her own lies, that she might tell you I was the thief and genuinely not remember that she'd done it herself. He looked at me with desperate eyes. I know I should have come to you anyway. I know I should have told you the truth and trusted you to believe me. But I was weak, Whitney. I was so tired of fighting her, and I just wanted to protect what little peace we had left. When did you actually help her? Marcus Chen asked, his pen poised. Lydia implied you participated directly. Never, my father said firmly. I never forged Whitney's signature. I never opened accounts in her name. I never took money from her accounts. The only thing I did was, sometimes I'd help your mother navigate the computer when she was confused, and a few times when she'd initiated a transfer from Whitney's account to ours, she'd get confused about how to complete it and ask me to finish the transaction. How many times? Chen asked. 3, maybe 4 times over the past 2 years. I thought they were the authorized transfers, the monthly support Whitney had set up. I didn't realize they were unauthorized until Whitney showed me the IP logs showing transactions I hadn't helped with. So you technically assisted in some transfers, but you believed they were authorized, Chen clarified. Yes, my father said. I would never have helped if I'd known they were theft. I looked at my father, this man who'd been silent my entire childhood, who'd let my mother treat me like I didn't matter, who'd finally stood up for me at that dinner table, and then given me the lockbox that started everything. Dad, I said, you were manipulated too, by Mum, by her illness, by your own fear. That doesn't make you innocent, but it doesn't make you a criminal either. I failed you, he said, tears streaming down his face now. I failed to protect you when you were a child. I failed to stop your mother from stealing from you. I failed to be the father you deserved. But you're here now, I said. You're telling the truth. You gave me the evidence I needed. You stood up to Mum at that dinner. You're choosing to do the right thing now, even though it's hard. I turned to look at Lydia, who was watching this exchange with something like disgust on her face. Dad was scared, I said to her. He was manipulated and abused by Mum for years. He made mistakes out of fear and weakness. But you... I stood up facing her across the table. You saw Mum's vulnerability and you exploited it. You saw an opportunity to profit from her illness and you took it. You actively encouraged her to commit crimes because those crimes benefited you. Dad was a victim. You were an accomplice. Well, that's not fair, Lydia said, but her voice was weak. It's absolutely fair, I said. And here's what's going to happen. You're going to accept my terms, you're going to repay the caregiver fraud. You're going to cooperate with the guardianship process. You're going to return the house deed. And you're going to do it because if you don't, I will file criminal charges and you will go to jail. Whitney, Lydia started. There's a difference between being weak and being criminal, I interrupted. Dad was weak. You were greedy, and you're going to learn what accountability means. Lydia refused to sign anything. She walked out of Marcus Chen's conference room with her head high, telling me I'd regret this, that I was destroying the family for money that Mum would never forgive me. My father tried to reason with her, but she wouldn't listen. She just left, slamming the door behind her, hard enough to rattle the framed diplomas on Chen's wall. Well, Chen said after a moment of stunned silence, I'll draft the complaint. 2 weeks later, the lawsuit was filed in civil court. Chen had worked quickly compiling every piece of evidence into a comprehensive case. The complaint listed 3 causes of action against Lydia Jordan: fraudulent collection of caregiver payments totaling $108,000, failure to repay a debt of $27,000 obtained through false pretenses, and complicity in identity theft resulting in damages of $55,000. Total damages sought $190,000 plus attorney fees and court costs. The filing became a matter of public record immediately. Anyone could search the county database and see Whitney Jordan v. Lydia Jordan with the full complaint attached. Lydia's employer saw it first. The insurance fraud allegations triggered an automatic internal investigation at her marketing firm. Any employee accused of fraud, even outside of work, had to be reviewed for ethics violations. She was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. I heard about it from my father, who'd heard it from Lydia in a hysterical phone call where she'd blamed everyone but herself. The leave was paid, but it was humiliating. Her colleagues knew. Her boss knew. The whole office knew that Golden Girl Lydia Jordan was being sued by her own sister for fraud. The social consequences spread faster than I'd anticipated. My mother's friends talked. Their daughters talked. Within a week, everyone in our extended social circle knew about the lawsuit. I started getting calls and messages from relatives I hadn't heard from in years, asking what was happening, telling me I should be ashamed, telling me family shouldn't air dirty laundry in court. I blocked most of them and ignored the rest. But Lydia couldn't block her own life from falling apart. Her longtime boyfriend, Michael, the one she was supposed to go to Europe with, ended their relationship. My father heard it from a mutual friend. Apparently, Michael had Googled Lydia's name after hearing rumours found the lawsuit and realised the woman he'd been dating for 3 years had been collecting fraudulent caregiver payments the entire time they'd been together. He'd asked her if it was true. She tried to explain to justify to make it sound less bad than it was. He'd broken up with her via text message. The European trip was cancelled. The apartment she couldn't quite afford without the fraudulent income became unsustainable. I heard through my father that she'd listed her car for sale, the leased BMW that had always seemed just slightly beyond her means. I tried not to take pleasure in any of it. I reminded myself that I hadn't wanted to destroy her life, just protect my own. But some small hurt part of me, the 8-year-old who didn't get piano lessons, the 16-year-old whose scholarship wasn't celebrated, the 35-year-old who'd been called cold and unloved, felt a bitter satisfaction at watching the golden child's wings melt. 3 weeks after the lawsuit was filed, I was working late at my office when my phone rang. A number I didn't recognise. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Whitney. The voice was small, broken. It's me. Lydia. Can you come to my apartment? I need to talk to you. We shouldn't be talking without lawyers present. I said, the professional response automatic. Please, she said, and she was crying. Please, Whitney, just 5 minutes. I'm not going to try anything. I just need to talk to you. Please. I should have said no. Marcus Chen would have told me to say no. But something in her voice reminded me of the sister she'd been. Before everything before, the lies and the fraud and the betrayal. The sister who taught me how to braid my hair when I was 6. The sister who'd let me sleep in her room when I had nightmares. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, I said. The drive to her apartment felt longer than it was. I didn't know what I was going to find when I got there. Part of me wondered if this was some kind of trap, if Lydia would try to manipulate me into dropping the lawsuit. But mostly I just felt tired. Tired of fighting. Tired of being angry. Tired of having a family that felt like a war zone. When I pulled into her parking garage, I saw her immediately. She wasn't in her apartment. She was sitting on the steps leading up to the building entrance, hugging her knees to her chest. She was wearing sweatpants and an old college t-shirt, her hair unwashed and pulled into a messy bun. No makeup, no polish, no performance. She looked up when she heard my footsteps, and I saw that her face was blotchy and swollen from crying. Her eyes were red, and raw mascara smeared down her cheeks like she'd been crying for hours and hadn't bothered to wash her face. This wasn't the golden child who'd sat at that dinner table accepting praise. This wasn't the confident sister who justified stealing from me. This was someone who looked like they'd been shattered and didn't know how to put the pieces back together. "Hi," she said, her voice hoarse. "Hi," I replied, stopping a few feet away. I didn't sit down, I waited. Lydia wiped her face with her sleeve, a gesture so uncharacteristically childlike it made my chest ache. "Can we talk?" she whispered. "Please, just 5 minutes. I know you hate me. I know you have every right to, but please, just 5 minutes." I looked at my sister, this person I'd grown up with, competed with, loved and resented in equal measure, sitting on concrete steps at 11 p.m. looking like her entire world had ended. "5 minutes," I said, and sat down beside her. We sat in silence for a moment, the parking garage security light humming above us, casting harsh shadows across Lydia's tear-stained face. I waited, letting her gather herself, refusing to make this easier by speaking first. "I'm sorry," she finally said, her voice so quiet I had to lean closer to hear. "I know that doesn't mean anything. I know it doesn't fix what I did. But I needed to say it. I'm sorry, Whitney." "For which part?" I asked. "For the caregiver fraud. For helping Mum steal from me, for taking the house, for calling me manipulative and cold while you were the one committing crimes." She flinched at each item on my list but didn't defend herself. "For all of it." "Why now?" I asked. "Because you got caught. Because there are consequences. Because your perfect life is falling apart. Because I can't live with myself anymore," she said, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. I thought I could justify it. I thought I could make it make sense, but I can't. Every time I look in the mirror, I see someone I don't recognize. Someone I hate. I didn't respond. I just waited. "You think I was happy?" Lydia said, pulling her knees tighter to her chest. "You think being the favourite was some kind of gift. But it wasn't, Whitney. It was a cage. A cage with a BMW and a downtown loft," I said, unable to keep the bitterness out of my voice. "A cage where I lived in terror every single day," she shot back, looking at me now. "Terror that I'd make one mistake and Mum would stop loving me. That I'd gain 5 pounds or miss a promotion or say the wrong thing and suddenly I'd be you. The one she didn't want. The accident." The word hung between us, sharp and ugly. "I knew she said that to you," Lydia admitted. "I heard her tell Aunt Linda. I was 13 and I heard her say you were an accident. And I remember thinking, I have to be perfect. Because if I'm not perfect, she'll decide she doesn't want me either. So you threw me under the bus to save yourself," I said. "Yes," Lydia said simply. "That's exactly what I did. Every time Mum compared us, every time she praised me and dismissed you, I should have stood up for you. But I didn't, because I was terrified that defending you would make me less valuable in her eyes." She wiped her face again, smearing the mascara further. "I wasn't happy being the favourite," she continued. I was exhausted. Do you know how hard it is to be perfect all the time? To never mess up, never show weakness, never admit you're struggling, because if I did, if I let the mask slip for even a second, I knew what would happen. I'd become you, and Mum would start treating me the way she treated you. That's not my fault, I said quietly. I know, Lydia said. I'm not saying it is. I'm just trying to explain why I did what I did. Why I went along with Mum's fraud. Why I took the caregiver money. Why I didn't stand up for you when you deserved it. You were scared, I said. I was terrified. And when Mum got sick, when her judgment started failing and she started doing more and more desperate things to hold on to control, I just enabled it. Because part of me thought if I helped her, if I was the good daughter who took care of things, she'd never abandon me the way she abandoned you. I looked at my sister, really looked at her, and for the first time I saw something I'd never seen before. Not the golden child, not the favourite, just another daughter damaged by a mother who'd never learned to love without conditions. You think I was happy? Lydia asked, her voice breaking. I lived in fear every single day. Fear that Mum would see me the way she saw you, that she'd look at me one day and realise I wasn't worth her love either, that I was just as worthless as she always told you that you were. I'm not worthless, I said firmly. I know that now, Lydia said. But Mum didn't, and I was so scared of her seeing me the way she saw you that I became someone I hate. Someone who steals and lies and hurts people to protect herself. Your fear doesn't erase what you did to me, I said after a long pause. I understand it. I even have compassion for it. But understanding why you hurt me doesn't mean I have to accept it. I know, Lydia whispered. You chose to hurt me to protect yourself, I continued. You had other options. You could have gotten therapy. You could have set boundaries with Mum. You could have gotten a second job instead of committing fraud. But you chose the easy path, the one that benefited you at my expense. You're right, Lydia said. That's when you crossed the line from victim to perpetrator. I said, when you made the conscious choice to exploit Mum's illness and my generosity for your own gain, I'm sorry you were trapped. I'm sorry you lived in fear, but that doesn't give you permission to hurt other people. Lydia nodded, crying silently now. We sat there for a while, the night air cool against my skin. I thought about walking away, leaving her there on those steps, letting the lawsuit play out in court. But I also thought about the 8-year-old girl who taught me to braid my hair, the sister I'd lost somewhere along the way to favouritism and fraud. I'll make you a deal, I said finally. One chance. That's all you get. Lydia looked up, hope flickering in her swollen eyes. You pay back $100,000 over 5 years, I said, monthly payment plan. You make a public apology, not some vague social media post, but a real specific acknowledgement of what you did. And you go to therapy. Real therapy with a licensed professional who specialises in family dysfunction. And if I do all that, Lydia asked, then I drop the identity theft portion of the lawsuit, I said. I'll pursue the caregiver fraud and the debt, but I won't push for criminal charges. You'll have a chance to rebuild your life without a felony record. And if I don't, she asked, though we both knew the answer. Then we go to trial, and I'll push for every charge Marcus Chen can file. You'll have a criminal record jail time, and you'll owe me even more in court costs and punitive damages. Lydia was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands. Can I ask you something? She finally said. What? Will you ever forgive me? I thought about that question, really thought about it. About 35 years of being invisible. About the pain of watching Lydia get everything while I got nothing. About the betrayal of discovering she'd actively helped steal from me. I don't know, I said honestly. Ask me again in 5 years, after you've shown me through actions, not words, that you've changed. Lydia didn't answer immediately. She sat there on those concrete steps, hugging her knees, staring out at the parking garage, like the answer might be written on the oil-stained pavement. I waited, giving her the space to make her choice. "Okay," she finally whispered. "I'll do it. All of it, like..." "I need you to be sure, Alice," I said. "Because if you agree and then back out, there won't be another chance. We go straight to trial." "I'm sure," she said, looking at me now. "I can't keep living like this. I can't keep being this person. If this is what it takes to fix what I broke, then I'll do it." 3 days later, we were back in Marcus Chen's conference room. This time, there was no social worker, no accusations, no dramatics, just Lydia, me, our father, and 2 attorneys reviewing a settlement agreement. The document was thorough. Lydia would pay $100,000 over 5 years in monthly installments of $1,667. She would return the quitclaim deed officially, transferring the house back to our parents' names, with a legally binding agreement that upon their deaths, the property would be split equally between Lydia and me. She would issue a written apology, admitting to the caregiver fraud and acknowledging the harm she'd caused. And she would provide quarterly proof of ongoing therapy attendance for a minimum of 2 years. In exchange, I would drop the identity theft allegations and agree not to pursue criminal charges. The caregiver fraud and debt claims would remain, but structured as a payment plan rather than a lump sum judgment. "This is generous," Lydia's attorney said quietly to her. "More generous than most plaintiffs would offer." "I know," Lydia said, and signed the document. I watched her signature, her real signature this time, not a forgery, appear on line after line. Each signature was an admission. Each initial an acknowledgement of harm done. When she finished, she slid the papers across to me. I signed as well, and then our attorneys notarized everything, making it legally binding. "It's done," Marcus Chen said, placing the documents in his briefcase. "The court will approve the settlement within 30 days, and the payment plan begins immediately." Lydia stood up, looking exhausted, but somehow lighter. "Thank you," she said to me, "for giving me a chance." I nodded, but didn't say anything. Words were cheap. I'd wait to see if she followed through. The guardianship proceedings moved faster than I'd expected. With Dr. Patel's medical documentation and my mother's clear cognitive impairment, the court approved the co-guardianship petition within 3 weeks. My father and I were now legally responsible for my mother's care finances and major life decisions. The first thing we did was hire a professional caregiver, a woman named Rosa, who came 5 days a week to help with medications, meals, and daily activities. My father still did most of the caregiving, but Rosa provided structure and ensured my mother couldn't access financial accounts or make unsupervised decisions. We also consolidated my parents' finances under a trust that required both my father and me to approve any transaction over $500. No more unauthorized loans, no more forged signatures, no more exploitation. My mother fought it at first, or tried to, but her lucid moments were becoming rarer, and most of the time she seemed relieved to have someone else managing the logistics of daily life. One evening, about 6 weeks after the settlement, my father called me. "Your mother asked about you today," he said. "She wanted to know why you don't visit anymore." "What did you tell her?" I asked. "I told her you've been busy with work, but that you'd come for dinner soon. She'd like that, I think, even if she doesn't quite remember why things have been difficult." I thought about that, about sitting at a dinner table with a woman who had stolen from me, lied to me, called me cold and unloved, but also with a woman who was sick, whose brain was betraying her, who might not remember any of it tomorrow. "Once a month," I said. "I'll come once a month, but I'm not pretending everything is fine, and if she gets cruel, even in her confusion, I'm leaving." "That's fair," my father said. So I established new boundaries. Family dinners once a month scheduled in advance. No surprise visits. No guilt trips about not coming more often. No discussions about money, past, present, or future. I would be civil and kind, but I would not be the invisible daughter accepting scraps of attention and calling it love. I also told my father that I reserved the right to decline any request from any family member without explanation or justification. If they asked for money for help for my time, I could simply say no. And no would be a complete sentence. He agreed to everything. He'd seen what the absence of boundaries had cost our family. Lydia made her first payment on time. $1,667 transferred to my account on the 1st of the month. The written apology arrived 2 days later, 3 pages handwritten acknowledging specifically what she'd done and the harm it had caused. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. She also sent me proof of her first therapy session, a receipt from a family trauma specialist. I filed everything in a folder and didn't respond. She'd asked for a chance to prove herself through actions. This was her proving it. 1 month down, 59 to go. The court approved the settlement. The house was officially back in my parents' names, with the inheritance split legally codified. The guardianship was finalised. The monthly payments began flowing. Everything was documented. Everything was legal. Everything had consequences and accountability built into the structure. I'd spent 35 years trying to earn love through sacrifice. Now I was learning to protect myself through boundaries. One afternoon, I was sitting at my desk at work when my managing director stopped by my office. "Whitney, do you have a minute?" she asked. "Of course," I said, gesturing to the chair across from me. "I wanted to let you know the partnership vote was unanimous. Congratulations, partner." I stared at her, the words not quite registering. "Partner." "You've earned it," she said. "Your client satisfaction scores are exceptional. Your portfolio performance is outstanding, and you've shown incredible grace under pressure this year, managing some difficult personal circumstances while never letting it affect your work." After she left, I sat alone in my office looking out at the city skyline and let myself feel the weight of that achievement. I'd made partner at a major financial firm, not because my mother approved, not because I'd sacrificed myself for my family's comfort, but because I was genuinely good at what I did. That evening, I drove to my parents' house for our monthly dinner. My mother greeted me at the door, confused about why I was there, but happy to see me. My father hugged me and whispered congratulations about the partnership I'd texted him earlier. Lydia arrived 15 minutes late, nervous and quiet, sitting across from me at the table. We ate together, not as a perfect family, not as people pretending the past hadn't happened, but as people learning to coexist with boundaries, accountability, and the understanding that love wasn't the same as accepting abuse. The dinner ended early. I left by 8, driving home to my own apartment where I could finally breathe. 1 year later, everything had changed. My mother no longer remembered most of what she'd done. The Alzheimer's had progressed faster than Dr. Patel had predicted, moving from stage 2 to stage 3 within 18 months. She now lived in a kind of permanent present, each moment disconnected from the last, her long-term memories fracturing like old photographs left too long in sunlight. She still lived at home with my father, but only because Rosa had gone from part-time to full-time care, and my father had transformed the first-floor den into a bedroom so my mother wouldn't have to navigate stairs. The house had been retrofitted with grab bars and reminder notes. Medications were locked in a safe that only Rosa and my father could access. I visited once a month, as promised. Sometimes my mother knew who I was. Sometimes she thought I was a childhood friend or a nurse or a stranger who'd wandered into her home. On her good days, she'd look at me with something that might have been recognition, might have been regret, and she'd reach for my hand. "I'm sorry," she'd whisper, though I was never sure what she was apologising for. So, the theft, the cruelty, the 35 years of invisibility? Or was she just sorry for being sick for losing herself, piece by piece? It didn't matter. By the next visit, she'd forgotten she'd apologised, forgotten she'd seen me at all. There was something both heartbreaking and merciful about her forgetting. She couldn't remember the lawsuit, couldn't remember losing control of her finances, couldn't remember that her daughters had been at war. In her fractured world, we were sometimes children again, and she'd ask my father where the girls were if they'd be home for dinner soon. Lydia had kept every single payment. 12 months times $1,667, $20,004 paid back so far. She'd also sent proof of therapy every quarter as required. Sometimes she sent brief updates with the receipts, started a new job, moved to a smaller apartment, sold the last of her designer furniture. She'd lost her position at the marketing firm. The internal investigation had concluded with a quiet termination, no formal charges, but no recommendation either. She'd spent 3 months unemployed before finding work at a much smaller agency for half her previous salary. No more BMW, no more downtown loft. She drove a used Toyota now and lived in a studio apartment in a neighbourhood she'd once have turned her nose up at. I'd seen her at the monthly dinners. She looked different, tired, humbler. She had stopped wearing makeup most of the time, stopped performing the role of golden child because there was no longer an audience demanding it. She spoke less, listened more, and apologised often too often, probably overcorrecting in the other direction. I didn't know yet if her transformation was genuine or just survival instinct. But she was showing up, following through, doing the work. That was more than she'd ever done before. My father had surprised me most of all. 3 months after the guardianship was established, he transferred $40,000 into my account, half of his retirement savings. When I'd called him confused, he'd simply said, "It's not enough to make up for everything, but it's what I can do." "Dad, you don't owe me." "I do," he'd interrupted. "I let your mother steal from you. I stayed silent when I should have spoken. This is my responsibility." I tried to refuse, but he'd been adamant. So I'd accepted it and put it in a savings account I didn't touch. Maybe someday I'd know what to do with money that was both a gift and an apology. He called me every week now, not about my mother's care or family logistics, but just to talk. About his day, his garden, the book he was reading. We'd never had that kind of relationship before. For 35 years he'd been present, but distant, loving, but silent. Now, finally, he was learning to be a father. As for me, I'd bought a house. Nothing extravagant, a small 3-bedroom craftsman with a garden and a porch swing. It was mine. Paid for with money I'd earned, decorated exactly how I wanted it, filled with silence that felt peaceful rather than lonely. The partnership had brought new responsibilities and better pay. I'd been managing a team of junior advisors and developing financial literacy programs for the firm's community outreach initiatives. One of those programs partnered with a local women's shelter, teaching financial independence skills to women escaping domestic violence. Teaching those classes had become the most meaningful part of my week. I'd see women who'd been controlled, exploited, told they couldn't manage on their own. And I'd watch them learn to read bank statements, build budgets, understand their credit reports. Watch them realise they were capable. Watch them discover their own worth. I understood them in ways my colleagues didn't. I knew what it was like to have someone you loved steal your identity, your money, your sense of self. I knew what it took to rebuild. On a Wednesday afternoon in November, I came home from work to find an envelope in my mailbox. Cream-coloured, my name written in my father's careful handwriting. I carried it inside, set it on my kitchen counter, and stared at it while I made tea. I knew what it was before I opened it. The annual Thanksgiving invitation. For the past decade, it had come from my mother, a group text, usually sent to Lydia and me with expected attendance assumed. This year, it came from my father, and it was just for me. I opened it slowly. "Whitney, I'm hosting Thanksgiving dinner this year. Nothing fancy. just turkey and the usual sides. Your mother will be there, though she may not understand what we're celebrating. Lydia will be there. Rosa will join us for dinner before her evening off. I know the last year has been difficult. I know holidays carry complicated memories for our family. But I'm hoping you'll come. Not because you have to, not because I expect you to pretend everything is fine, but because you're my daughter, and I'd like you at my table. If you come as you are. If you need to leave early, leave. If you don't come at all, I'll understand. Either way, I'm grateful for you. Dad, I read it 3 times, my tea cooling forgotten beside me. I thought about Thanksgivings past, the ones where I'd sat at the corner of the table, invisible, watching Lydia receive all the warmth I'd craved. The ones where I'd helped cook and clean while being told I'd contributed nothing. But I also thought about the monthly dinners over the past year, how they'd been awkward but not hostile, how my mother's confusion had somehow levelled the playing field. She couldn't play favourites when she couldn't remember which daughter was which, how Lydia and I had started to talk again carefully, tentatively, without the competition that had poisoned us for decades. I picked up my phone and called my father. I got your invitation, I said when he answered, and he asked, and I heard hope and resignation in equal measure. I'll come, I said, but I'm bringing pie instead of making it there, and I'm leaving by 7. That's perfect, he said, and I heard him smile through the phone. Thank you, Whitney. After we hung up, I sat in my quiet house, my house that I'd bought with my own money, that no one could take from me, and realised I was ready. Not ready to forget. Not ready to pretend the past hadn't happened, but ready to sit at a table with my family and see what we might become now that the old dynamics had finally been dismantled. Ready to have Thanksgiving with boundaries intact and nothing left to prove. I arrived at my parents' house at 4:30 on Thanksgiving afternoon, carrying a pumpkin pie from the bakery near my new house. I'd thought about making one from scratch, but decided against it. That felt too much like the old Whitney, the one who proved her worth through effort no one acknowledged. This Whitney bought a perfectly good pie and felt no guilt about it. My father answered the door before I knocked, like he'd been watching for my car. He smiled, genuine and warm, and pulled me into a hug. I'm glad you came, he said quietly. Me too, I replied and meant it. The house smelled like turkey and sage. Rosa was in the kitchen, and my mother sat in the living room in her favourite chair, staring peacefully at the window. Lydia was setting the table. She looked up when I entered and offered a small, uncertain smile. Hi, she said. Hi, I said back. No performance, no competition, just 2 sisters existing in the same space. The table was arranged differently than I remembered. My father sat at one end with me to his right. Lydia sat across from me. My mother's chair was at the head of the table, Rosa beside her to help with eating. I wasn't at the corner anymore. I wasn't invisible. I was right next to my father in a place of honour I'd never been given before. We ate, and it was surprisingly comfortable. My mother didn't say much occasionally, asking who we all were. Rosa gently redirected her. Lydia talked about her new job carefully, avoiding mention of money. My father asked me about work, and I told him about the financial literacy classes, about women learning to manage their own accounts for the first time. You're good at that, my father said, helping people find their way. I learned from experience, I said, and he nodded, understanding the weight behind those words. After dinner, while Rosa helped my mother and Lydia clear dishes, my father asked me to come to his study. He pulled a small wooden box from his desk drawer. I found this when I was cleaning out the attic last month, he said, handing it to me. I thought you should have it. I opened the box. Inside was a child's drawing, carefully preserved. Crayon on construction paper, the colours faded but still visible. 4 stick figures holding hands. A house behind them. A sun in the corner. At the bottom, in careful 2nd grade handwriting, My Family by Whitney, age 8. I stared at that drawing, at the hopeful simplicity of it. 4 people holding hands, equal, together, the family I'd wanted us to be. I remember when you drew that, my father said softly. You gave it to your mother and she put it on the refrigerator for a day before it disappeared. I found it in a box of old papers. She'd kept it even if she never told you. I traced the stick figures with my finger, that 8-year-old girl's dream of belonging. I used to think family meant unconditional love, I said quietly, that if I just tried hard enough, I'd earn a place at this table. You always had a place, my father said. We just did a terrible job of showing you. I know that now, I said, but I also know something else. Family is where you have to set conditions to protect yourself. Where boundaries aren't walls, they're doors you can open when it's safe and close when it's not. I looked up at my father. I don't have a fairy tale ending. Mum never truly apologised while she was lucid. Lydia's trying, but I don't know if she really understands what she did. And I'm not sure I'll ever fully trust either of them again. That's okay, my father said. You don't have to. But I have something more valuable than their understanding, I continued. I have my own respect. I have boundaries that protect me. I have a life I built for myself, not for their approval. And that's enough. My father hugged me again, and I let myself lean into it. I left at 6:45. Lydia walked me to my car. Thank you for coming, she said. I know it's still hard. It is, I agreed, but it's getting easier. I made this month's payment yesterday, she said. I know, I said. 14 more to go. She nodded, understanding that this was the language we spoke now. Not apologies and promises, but actions and follow-through. I drove away from my parents' house, watching it shrink in my rearview mirror. The house where I'd grown up invisible. The house where I'd finally been seen. The house I'd never live in again, but could visit when I chose. I thought about that little girl's drawing. 4 people holding hands. The family I'd wanted. I didn't have that family. Probably never would. But I had something better. I had myself, whole, boundaried, free. I pulled up to my own house and sat in the driveway for a moment, feeling the weight of everything that had changed. From today forward, I whispered to myself, to that 8-year-old girl, to every version of me that had waited to be chosen, I live for myself. And that's the greatest gift I could ever give me. I got out of the car and walked to my front door, leaving the past in the rearview mirror where it belonged. So that's Whitney's story. Not a fairy tale ending where everyone hugs and cries and pretends the past never happened. But something better, a real ending. One where she chose herself, set boundaries that actually meant something, and built a life where her worth wasn't measured by how much she could sacrifice or how invisible she could make herself. She didn't get her mother's apology while she was still lucid. She didn't get the sister relationship she'd always wanted. But she got her money back, her dignity restored, and most importantly, she got herself back. Sometimes justice doesn't look like revenge. Sometimes it looks like walking away with your head high and your bank account protected. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever been the invisible one in your family, the one who gave everything and got nothing back? Have you had to set boundaries with people you love, knowing it might cost you the relationship? Drop your story in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, if Whitney's journey felt familiar or gave you courage to stand up for yourself, hit that subscribe button. There are more stories like this one. Stories about ordinary people who found extraordinary strength when they finally decided they were worth fighting for. Your story matters. Your worth matters. And you deserve better than being invisible.